world
mid-morning
felt
light,
boundless at
usually
18.
a comforting,
A vibrant
golden wash
canvas
through the bay
painted with
window
the
of my
hues
home
of
office,
first love.
felt
Her
different that
name was
day.
Sarah,
It was
and she
early
was
spring,
everything I
the
thought I
kind of
wanted,
day where the air still held a
vivacious,
crisp edge, but
quick-witted,
the sun
and
promised
possessed of a
warmer days
smile that
ahead,
could melt
coaxing the
glaciers.
first brave
We were
crocuses from the
inseparable,
thawing earth.
two halves of
My
a
world,
perfectly
for the
formed
past
whole,
2 years,
or so I
had
believed.
largely revolved
Our
around the
days
quiet
were a
hum of my
blur of
laptop,
shared
the
laughter,
rhythmic click of my
late-night
keyboard,
conversations that
and the
stretched into
occasional
dawn,
distant chirping
and the
of
kind of
birds.
innocent,
Working from home
all-consuming
had
passion that
transformed
only
my daily
youth can
routine
truly
from a frantic
understand.
dash to the
I
office
was
into a
utterly,
serene, almost
irrevocably
monastic
smitten,
existence,
convinced that she was my
punctuated only by
forever,
virtual
my
meetings
destiny.
and the gentle rhythm
Every
of domestic
decision,
life.
every
Our
future
house,
plan,
nestled
revolved
on a
around her.
quiet, tree-lined
Our
street,
lives were
was usually a
intertwined, our
sanctuary,
ambitions
a place where
aligned,
the
or
biggest
so it
drama was
seemed.
whether the Wi-Fi
We
would
spoke
glitch
of
during a
moving in
crucial video
together,
call.
of carving
But
out
that
our own little
Tuesday,
corner of the
something
world,
shattered the
a
tranquility.
sanctuary built on
My
the
gaze,
bedrock of our
habitually
affection.
drifting
The
towards the
future,
street
as
during
I
moments of
envisioned it then,
contemplation
was a
or when a
sun-drenched
particularly
path
complex
stretching
spreadsheet
endlessly
demanded a
before
mental
us,
pause,
with Sarah
caught an
always
anomaly.
by my
A
side.
figure was moving
My
slowly
family
along the
adored
curb,
her. My
not with
friends
the
welcomed her
purposeful
into
stride
our
of a
tight-knit
jogger or the
circle,
leisurely
and I
pace of
felt a
someone walking
profound
their
sense of
dog.
contentment,
This
a
person was
quiet
methodical,
certainty that I had
almost
found my
clinical,
person.
and they were holding
Life was
something.
simple,
My eyes
uncomplicated,
narrowed,
and filled
trying
with
to
an
resolve the
almost
blurred
naive
shape into something
optimism.
familiar.
I was a
It
young
wasn't a
man,
delivery
just
driver,
stepping into
their
adulthood,
uniform was
with a
wrong,
heart
and they weren't
overflowing with
carrying a
love and a
package.
future
As
that
they drew
sparkled with
closer,
promise.
the object in
The
their hands
challenges of
became
the world
clearer.
seemed
A
distant,
camera,
easily
its lens
conquerable
glinting in
as
the
long as
sunlight
we
like a
faced them
predatory
together.
eye. A
I
prickle of
remember those
unease,
days with a
cold and
bittersweet
sharp,
ache, a
traced its way
phantom
down my
limb of a
spine.
happiness that
Who was
once was,
this?
before
And
the
why were
cracks
they so
began to
intently
show,
focused
before the
on
true nature
our
of things
asterisk
revealed
side of the
itself,
street?
before a
My
small,
mind, usually a
terrified
well-oiled
dog entered our
machine of
lives
data
and
analysis and
irrevocably
project
changed
management,
everything. It
began
was
to
a
whir with
time
a
of
different
blissful
kind of
ignorance,
processing.
a
I
prelude to the
watched, a
storm I never
silent,
saw coming,
unmoving
a
observer
storm
from
that would
behind the
test the
sheer
very
curtains of my
foundations
office
of my
window,
character and
as the
redefine
individual
what
paused
love truly
directly in
meant.
front of our
Then
property.
came Luna.
They lifted the
Sarah
camera,
had
a
always talked
professional-looking
about wanting
device
a
with a
dog,
large
but I
telephoto
never
lens,
imagined the
and began to
circumstances under which
systematically
we'd find
photograph
her.
our vehicles.
One afternoon,
We had 3
Sarah
cars
called
in our
me,
driveway,
her voice
my
trembling with a
reliable
mixture
sedan,
of
my
horror and
husband's work
fierce
truck,
determination.
and my son's older,
She'd been
but perfectly
volunteering at a
functional,
local animal
compact
shelter,
car.
and a new
Each was
arrival
parked
had just come
neatly,
in.
well within our
The
property lines,
details were
not
sparse,
obstructing
but
the
the
sidewalk
implications
or
were
any
clear.
neighbor's view.
Luna had
There was
endured
nothing,
unimaginable
absolutely
cruelty.
nothing, about
She
their
was a
placement or
small,
condition that
scruffy
should
terrier
warrant this
mix,
kind of
no
scrutiny.
more than a year
My
old,
confusion
and every
deepened,
inch of her tiny
quickly
body
morphing
seemed
into
to
a simmering
radiate fear.
irritation.
Her fur
This
was
felt
matted,
intrusive,
her
an
ribs
unwarranted
protruded
invasion
sharply,
of our
and her
private
eyes,
space.
when you could
My
catch a glimpse
fingers,
of them,
which
were
moments
wide
before had
with a
been flying
deep,
across the
primal
keyboard,
terror.
now lay
The shelter
still,
staff
poised
explained
over
that
the
she had been
delete key,
found in a
the half-written
horrific
email
state,
forgotten.
neglected
My
and
focus
abused,
was
and the
entirely
trauma had
outside,
left an
on this
indelible
stranger
mark.
who was meticulously
Specifically,
documenting our
they
lives
warned
without
us,
permission.
Luna was
As the
terrified of
person
men.
lowered the camera,
Every male
their
voice,
uniform became
every
fully
sudden movement,
discernible.
every
It was a
outstretched
crisp,
hand from a man
official-looking
sent her
khaki,
cowering,
adorned with
whimpering,
patches I
or
couldn't
even
quite make out
snapping
from
in a
my
desperate
vantage point.
attempt to protect
But the
herself.
overall impression was
Sarah,
undeniably
with her compassionate
governmental.
heart,
Code
felt an
enforcement.
immediate,
The words
overwhelming
formed in my
connection to
mind,
Luna.
cold and
She saw
certain,
beyond the
like a
fear,
verdict.
beyond the
My
scars,
heart gave a
to the
little
gentle
lurch,
soul
not
she
of guilt,
believed was
for I
hidden
knew
beneath.
we were in compliance,
She was
but of
determined
a
to
sudden,
adopt her,
chilling
to give Luna
realization.
the safe,
This
loving
wasn't
home
random.
she deserved.
This wasn't a
I,
mistake.
of course, supported
Someone
her.
had called them.
My heart
And in
ached
our
for the little
quiet,
creature,
generally
and I
harmonious
wanted nothing
neighborhood,
more than to see
there was
her
only
heal.
one person
But
who
the
would stoop to
reality
such
of Luna's
petty,
fear was
vindictive
stark.
measures.
When I
A
first
name,
tried to approach
sharp and
her, even
unwelcome,
slowly,
immediately sprang
speaking
to
in a
mind.
soft,
Brenda,
reassuring tone,
our
she would
neighbor from 2
freeze, her
houses
body
down,
rigid,
a woman
her
whose
eyes
life seemed
darting
to revolve
wildly,
around stirring
before
up
she'd
drama and
scramble
making
away,
everyone else's
whimpering,
existence
trying
just a
to
little
make
bit more
herself invisible.
complicated.
It was
Brenda,
heartbreaking
with
to
her
witness.
perpetually aggrieved
Sarah would
expression
hold
and her
her,
uncanny
murmuring
ability to
soothing
find
words,
fault where
while
none
Luna
existed.
would press herself
Brenda,
against her,
who had a history,
trembling,
a long and
occasionally
tedious
glancing
history,
at me with
of
an
reporting
expression
minor
of pure,
infractions, real or
unadulterated
imagined,
terror.
to
The
various
shelter
city
staff had been
departments.
right.
My
Luna's
initial
fear of men
irritation
was
solidified
profound,
into
a
a concrete
deeply ingrained
suspicion,
response to past
heavy and
trauma.
undeniable.
It was a challenge,
This wasn't just a
certainly,
code
but one I
enforcement
was
officer.
ready to face.
This was
I
Brenda's
knew it wouldn't
latest
be
salvo
easy,
in a
that it would
long-running,
require immense
one-sided
patience
neighborhood
and
feud.
an understanding
The
heart.
thought,
But I was
once
committed
formed,
to helping
settled
Luna
in my
overcome
gut
her
like a
fears,
cold,
to show
hard
her that
stone.
not all
My
men were
peaceful
monsters.
morning, my
I wanted to
productive
be the
work-from-home
exception,
bubble,
the one
had
who
just
proved
been
to her that
irrevocably
love and
popped.
kindness
The
could heal
game,
even
it
the
seemed,
deepest
was
wounds.
afoot.
This
And I
wasn't
had a
just
very
about
strong
Sarah's new
feeling
pet.
I knew
It was
exactly
about a
who the
promise to a
instigator
vulnerable
was.
creature,
My
a silent
suspicion
vow to
solidified into
restore her faith
certainty the
in
moment the
humanity,
code
one
enforcement
gentle
officer
step at a
began
time.
walking towards
The
our
initial
front
days
door.
with Luna
There
were a
was a
delicate
deliberate,
dance of
almost
caution and
theatrical
quiet
slowness to his
perseverance.
approach, as
Every
if he were
interaction
savouring the
was a
moment
test,
before
a
delivering
slow,
unwelcome news.
painstaking
I
effort to
pushed back from
dismantle
my
the
desk,
walls of
the
fear
swivel
she had
chair
built
groaning
around
softly in
herself.
protest.
I learned
and
to move
moved towards the
slowly,
front
to
window,
speak in a
pulling
voice
the sheer
barely above
curtain
a
aside
whisper,
just
to
enough to
avoid
observe
direct eye
without being
contact that
immediately
might be
seen.
perceived as
My
a threat.
heart was thudding a
I
little
would sit on
faster
the
now,
floor,
a
several feet
drumbeat of
away from her,
anticipation mixed
simply
with a
existing
rising
in the
tide of
same space,
indignation.
reading a
I
book
knew,
or
with an
quietly
almost
watching
psychic
TV,
certainty,
allowing her
that
to
this was
observe me
about
without
Brenda.
pressure.
But what
Sarah was
exactly had she
incredible,
concocted this
acting as a
time?
bridge
The
between us,
officer reached our
gently
porch, a
encouraging Luna
clipboard
to take
clutched in one
tiny
hand,
steps forward.
the camera now
She would
slung over
hold
his
Luna,
shoulder. He
speaking
pressed the
softly,
doorbell, a
stroking her
polite,
fur,
firm ring
and
that
then,
echoed
ever
through the
so
quiet
subtly,
house.
guide
I
her
took a
attention
deep
towards
breath,
me.
steeling
Luna
myself.
would watch me with those
This wasn't
wide,
just a random
wary
official
eyes,
visit.
her body
It was a
tense, ready to
confrontation,
bolt at the
albeit a
slightest
bureaucratic one,
provocation. I
instigated
started
by
leaving
malice.
treats on the floor
I
a few
opened the
feet from
door,
where I sat,
plastering on a
then
neutral,
slowly,
questioning expression,
incrementally, closer
attempting
to
to
me.
project an
It
air
was a
of calm
painstaking
competence
process.
rather than the simmering
For
fury
days,
I felt
she
internally.
wouldn't approach them if I
"Good
was in the
morning,"
room.
he said,
Then,
his
one
voice
evening,
surprisingly
I pretended
mild,
to be asleep
almost
on the couch,
apologetic.
and I heard the
He was a
soft
man in
patter
his
of her
late
paws,
40s or early
followed by the
50s,
faint sound
with
of her
kind eyes
sniffing
that
and then
seemed
the
at
gentle
odds with the
crunch of a
sternness of his
biscuit.
uniform.
It was a
"I'm
small
with
victory,
code
but it
enforcement.
felt
I'm
monumental.
here regarding a
Over
complaint
weeks,
about
these
vehicles on
tiny
your
breakthroughs
property."
accumulated.
A
I
complaint.
began to notice her
I
tail give a
echoed,
slight,
my voice
almost
carefully modulated
imperceptible
to convey
wag when I
polite
entered her
surprise,
room.
not
She would no
accusation.
longer bolt from the
"About our
room when I stood
vehicles.
up.
I assure
Instead, she
you,
might
they're
just
all
flinch,
registered,
then
in
cautiously
short,
watch me.
and parked
My
entirely on our
strategy was
private
simple:
property."
consistency,
I gestured vaguely
patience,
towards the
and
driveway,
absolute
as if
non-aggression.
inviting him to
I never
inspect them more
forced an
closely.
interaction.
He
I
nodded,
let her come
his
to
gaze
me on
sweeping
her
over the
terms.
driveway,
I started
lingering for
leaving
a
my
moment
hand
on my
resting on the
son's
floor,
compact car.
palm up,
Yes,
offering
well,
it as a
the
safe,
complaint specifically
unthreatening
mentioned an
presence.
abandoned
One
vehicle,
day,
and also,
after what felt like
a
an
borrowed
eternity,
car.
she crept
The
forward,
words hit me like
sniffing
a
my
physical
fingers
blow,
tentatively,
even though they
before
were
giving my
delivered
hand
without
a quick,
malice. A
gentle lick.
borrowed car.
My heart swelled.
The phrase
It was
hung
a
in the
tiny
air,
gesture,
a
but
perfectly
it spoke
crafted piece of
volumes.
Brenda's particular
Slowly,
brand of
the flinching
passive-aggressive
lessened.
poison.
The
My
cowering
internal
diminished.
monologue screamed,
She began to
asterisk
approach me,
bingo,
first for
asterisk
treats,
that was
then
it.
for a tentative
That was the
sniff,
smoking
and
gun.
eventually,
No
for
one
a
else
quick,
in the neighborhood,
hesitant head
no
scratch
casual
before
passerby,
retreating.
would ever
The
use such a
transformation was
specific,
gradual,
loaded term.
almost
It was
imperceptible day
Brenda's
by day,
signature,
but
her way of
looking
implying
back, it
something
was
illicit,
profound.
something not
Luna was
quite
starting
right,
to
without
understand that I was
outright
not a
stating
threat,
it.
that
My
my
son
presence meant
occasionally borrowed a
safety,
car from
not
his
fear.
friend, a
She
perfectly
was beginning
legal
to
and common
thrive,
arrangement.
her fur
But
gaining a
Brenda,
healthy
in her
sheen,
twisted
her
perception,
eyes losing
had
some
clearly
of their
spun it
haunted
into
look,
something
replaced
nefarious,
by a
something
glimmer of
worthy of a code
curiosity and
violation.
even, dare I
The sheer
say,
pettiness of
affection.
it was
She
breathtaking.
was still a timid
My
dog,
polite
but the
facade
terror was
remained,
fading,
but my
replaced
eyes
by a
narrowed
budding
almost
trust that filled me
imperceptibly.
with a
"I
quiet
see,"
pride.
I said,
This was
my
more than
voice a
just
little
earning a
tighter than
dog's
before.
trust. It felt
"And
like
which
healing a
vehicle are
broken
we
spirit,
referring to
and it
as
was a bond
borrowed?"
one cherished
I
deeply.
already knew the
Luna's
answer.
transformation was
He
nothing
gestured
short
towards
of
my son's
miraculous.
car.
The
The blue
timid,
sedan.
cowering
It was
creature who had
reported
once
as being
trembled at
parked
my
here
shadow
for an
was
extended
slowly
period,
blossoming into
not
a
registered
playful,
to this address.
affectionate companion.
He then
Her
pointed to
tail,
the rear
once
license
tucked
plate,
perpetually
and
between
it
her
appears the
legs,
tag is
now
expired.
wagged with an
My
enthusiastic
son,
blur whenever
bless
I
his
entered
heart,
the room.
had just walked
She
into the
started
living room,
greeting me at the
drawn
door,
by the
a
unusual
soft whine
presence
of
of a
excitement
uniformed officer
escaping her
at our
lips,
door.
her
He
body
was a
wiggling
tall,
with joy.
lanky
The
teenager,
fear in her
usually
eyes had been
absorbed in his
replaced
video
by a
games or
bright,
coding projects,
intelligent
but
sparkle,
keenly
and she
aware of
would
his
even
surroundings.
nudge my hand for
At the
pets,
mention of his
leaning
car,
into my
his
touch
head
with a
snapped up.
contented sigh.
"Expired
Our
tag?"
walks became
he
a highlight
questioned,
of my
a
day.
flicker of
She
annoyance
trotted
crossing his
confidently
face.
beside me,
"No way,
her nose
I
to the
just
ground,
renewed it."
exploring the
He
world with a
strode past me,
newfound
heading
curiosity.
straight for the car.
She
I
loved
watched
chasing
him, a
squirrels in
mix
the
of
park,
pride and
her barks now
exasperation
playful
swelling
and
within
full
me.
of life,
My
rather than
son,
fearful
like me,
yelps.
was not one
It
to
was
be easily
incredibly
pushed around,
rewarding to witness her
especially when he knew
blossoming,
he was in
to
the
see the
right.
true,
He
happy
crouched
dog
down by the
emerge from
license
beneath
plate,
layers of
then
past
straightened
trauma.
up with a triumphant
Sarah and I
grin.
often marveled at her
"Aha!
progress.
It's right here."
We'd share stories
He
of
reached
Luna's
into the glove
latest antics,
compartment,
laughing
pulled
at her
out a
quirky
small,
habits and
rectangular
celebrating
sticker,
every
and with a
small step
satisfying
forward.
peel, seal,
Luna
slapped it
became a
onto the
central
corner of the
part of our
license
lives,
plate.
a furry
C.
testament to the
Valid for
power of
another year.
patience and love.
The
She
officer,
was no
who had
longer
watched
just
this
Sarah's
impromptu
dog. She
demonstration
was
with
our
a faint
dog,
smile,
a shared
nodded.
responsibility and a
Well,
source of
that takes care
immeasurable
of
joy
that.
for both of us.
Good on you for having
I
it
felt
readily
a deep connection
available.
to her. A
He
bond
made a note
forged
on
in the
his
quiet
clipboard,
moments of
crossing
trust
something
building,
out.
in the countless
However,
hours
he
spent
continued,
convincing her
his
that the
tone
world,
becoming
and
slightly more
specifically
formal.
men,
The
could be
primary
kind.
issue, as
She
per the
would often
complaint,
curl up at
is
my
that the
feet
vehicle
while
is
I worked or
registered to a
studied,
different
a
address and has been
warm,
parked here
comforting presence.
consistently.
Her
While
soft
it's not
snores
strictly
a lullaby
abandoned
in
if
the
it's in
background.
working order,
However,
the
as
city
the months
ordinance states
passed,
that
a subtle
vehicles not
shift began
registered to
to
the
occur
property
in our
address
lives.
cannot be
My
permanently
college
stored here.
schedule became
They
more
must be
demanding,
moved daily,
requiring
even if
longer
just a
hours
short
on
distance,
campus and
to
more
demonstrate
intense
they are
study
not being
sessions.
used as long-term
Sarah, too,
storage.
started a new
My jaw
part-time job
tightened.
that had
Moved
irregular hours,
daily,
often
This
keeping
was
her out
beyond
late.
petty.
The
It was an
initial
active
excitement of these new
inconvenience
ventures
designed
slowly
purely
gave
to
way to a
harass.
quiet strain
Brenda's
on our
fingerprints
routine
were all
and,
over
by
this.
extension,
She
on
knew my
Luna's
son was
well-being.
often busy with
We had
school and
always
work,
prided
and this
ourselves
was
on
a deliberate
providing Luna
attempt
with
to make his
consistent
life,
care,
and by
but the demands
extension,
of our
our
individual
lives, more
lives started to
difficult.
create
The
gaps.
absurdity of
I
it was
noticed it
almost
first,
comical,
a
if it
creeping
weren't so
unease that settled in
infuriating.
my stomach.
So,
The
just to be
walks became
clear,
less
I
frequent,
stated,
the
my voice
playtime shorter.
dangerously calm.
I tried to
My
pick up
son
the
has to
slack
move his
whenever I
car
could,
every
but
single
my own
day,
commitments
even if it's
often
just
made
from
it
the driveway
impossible
to the
to
street
maintain
and
the
back,
rigorous schedule
because it's
Luna
registered
needed.
to an address
I
2
brought it up
blocks
to
away,
Sarah
even
gently,
though he lives here.
suggesting we needed to be
That's
more mindful,
correct,
to
the
ensure
officer
Luna wasn't
confirmed,
being neglected.
still maintaining
She
his
agreed, of
polite
course,
demeanor.
but the
It's
words
to
felt
prevent
hollow,
properties
a
from being
promise
used
easily
as
made but
unofficial
rarely
parking
kept.
lots for
The
vehicles
first
not
faint
associated
cracks
with the
in our
residents.
seemingly
A
perfect
common
life
issue,
began to
I
appear,
assure you.
subtle at first,
He seemed to
almost
sense my rising
imperceptible, but they
frustration,
were there,
adding,
and they were
it's a
growing.
technicality,
The subtle
but a
shifts
valid
in our
one,
schedules
according to the
soon
complaint.
escalated into a
My
noticeable
son,
decline in
however,
Luna's health
seemed
and
to take a
happiness.
perverse
It
delight in the
started
instruction.
gradually,
He
almost
exchanged a quick,
imperceptibly,
knowing
but then
glance with me,
accelerated
a
with
spark of
alarming
mischief
speed.
in his eyes that I
I'd come home from
recognized
a long day
instantly.
of classes,
He was a master
exhausted
of
but
passive
eager to see
aggression,
Luna,
a trait he
only to
had,
find her
regrettably,
listless, lying
inherited
in her
from
bed,
me.
not
Move
even
it
bothering
daily,
to greet
he
me at the
repeated,
door with
a
her
slow,
usual
almost
enthusiastic
theatrical smile
wiggles.
spreading
Her
across his
once
face.
vibrant,
Oh,
healthy coat
I can
began to lose
absolutely
its
do
sheen,
that.
becoming
Every
dull and
single day.
greasy.
No
Then came
problem
the
at
weight
all.
gain. It
His
wasn't just
tone
a
was
few extra
saccharine sweet,
pounds.
almost
Luna
too
was
eager,
ballooning, her
a clear
small
signal
frame
that he was already
struggling under the
concocting
sudden
ways to
excess.
turn this
Her belly
inconvenience into a
sagged,
subtle act
her
of
legs seemed
defiance,
to buckle under
perhaps
her,
even a
and
public
her
spectacle.
movements became
The
sluggish
officer,
and
perhaps
labored.
missing the
The
underlying
playful energy that
sarcasm,
had once
simply
defined her
nodded,
was gone,
finished his notes,
replaced by
and
a
handed me a
lethargy
small
that broke my
pamphlet
heart.
detailing the
But the
relevant
most
code.
distressing
That should
changes were
cover
her
it for
skin
now.
issues and
Just
the smell.
ensure the
Her
vehicle is
skin
moved
developed angry
regularly.
red
We'll
patches,
check back in a few
particularly
weeks
around
to
her belly
confirm
and
compliance.
paws, which she would
He
constantly
gave a
scratch
small,
and lick,
almost apologetic
creating
bow
raw,
of his head,
irritated
then
sores.
turned and
The
walked back down
scratching
our
was
driveway.
relentless,
I
a
watched him
constant,
go, my
irritating
mind already
sound that
racing,
permeated the
plotting.
apartment.
As he
And then there
reached the
was the
street,
smell.
instead
It
of
was a
turning right or
pervasive,
left to leave the
unpleasant
neighborhood,
odor,
he
a mix
paused.
of stale
Then,
dog,
to my
unwashed
intense
fur, and
satisfaction,
something
he
vaguely
turned left
yeasty and
in the
infected.
direction of Brenda's
It clung
house,
to the
2
furniture,
doors down.
to her bed,
He didn't
to
just
the
walk
very
past
air
it.
in the
He
apartment.
slowed,
I
then
tried to
stopped
mask it
directly
with
in
air
front of her
fresheners,
property,
but it was
pulling
futile.
out his camera
It was
once
the
more.
smell of
A
neglect,
slow,
a pungent
vindictive smile
testament to the
began to
lack of
spread
proper
across my
care.
face.
My heart
Oh,
ached every time
Brenda,
I looked at her.
you had no
This
idea what
wasn't
you
the
had just
Luna I had
unleashed.
patiently
A
nurtured back
delicious,
to health.
almost wicked
This
sense
was
of
a shadow of her
anticipation
former
bubbled within
self,
me as
a
I watched the
sad,
code enforcement
uncomfortable
officer
creature.
pause in front of
I
Brenda's
started asking
house.
Sarah
It
about it,
wasn't just a
gently at
fleeting
first,
glance.
then
He
with
stopped,
increasing
pulled out his
urgency.
camera again,
Luna
and
seems
began to
really
survey
off,
her property
Sarah.
with the same
Have you
meticulous
noticed how
attention
much
he had
weight
given
she's
ours.
gained? And
My
her
initial
skin looks
anger,
terrible.
still simmering beneath the
Sarah would
surface,
offer
was
vague
now mingling
assurances.
with a potent
Oh, she's
cocktail of
fine, maybe
satisfaction
just
and a
a bit
burgeoning
lazy.
sense of
But
strategic
the evidence
opportunity.
was
This
undeniable.
was it.
The
This
smell,
was the
the
moment.
scratching, the
Brenda's
excessive
house
weight.
was,
It
to
was
put it
all
mildly,
screaming
an
neglect.
eyesore. For
Finally,
years,
I
she had
confronted her
boasted
more
about grand
directly.
renovation plans,
Sarah, what's going
vague
on with Luna?
pronouncements about
She's
transforming
gained
her
so much
property
weight,
into some
her
kind of
skin is
architectural
awful,
marvel.
and she smells
Yet,
terrible.
the
When was
reality
the
was a
last time
chaotic
she was
mess.
walked properly?
Her front
Or
yard,
bathed?
once a respectable
Her
patch of
response
grass,
was a
had
casual
become a
shrug,
haphazard
a
collection of
dismissive
half-finished
wave of her
projects.
hand.
Piles
Oh,
of
I
lumber,
haven't really
stacks
had
of bricks,
time,
tarps
she
covering
admitted,
who knew
her
what,
voice
all
devoid of any
slowly
real
being
concern.
reclaimed by an
I haven't
ever-encroaching
walked her in
tide of
months,
weeds.
and I haven't
It wasn't
bathed her
just
at all.
untidy.
It's been
It was a
so busy
blatant
with work and
disregard for
everything.
neighborhood aesthetics
My
and,
blood
I
ran cold.
suspected, for
Months?
basic city
No
ordinances.
walks?
Her
No baths?
backyard, which I
The
had only
flimsy
glimpsed over the
excuse that
fence on rare
followed,
occasions,
something about being
was
too
rumored to be
tired
even
or
worse,
having too
a
much on her
veritable
plate,
junkyard of
only
discarded
fueled the
furniture,
inferno of
construction
anger that
debris,
began to
and
simmer within
overgrown
me.
vegetation.
It wasn't just
I
about the
retreated
neglect.
from the window,
It was about the
a triumphant
casual
smirk
indifference,
playing on
the
my
utter
lips.
lack of
My son,
responsibility.
still
The
basking
girl
in
I
the
thought
glow
I
of his
knew,
petty
the
victory,
one who had been
looked at
so
me, a
determined to
question in
save
his
Luna,
eyes.
was now the
So,
very
what
person
now,
causing her
Mom?
suffering.
Do I really
The
have to
betrayal
move
of
it
Luna
every
was a
day?
betrayal of everything
Oh,
I thought we
yes,
stood for.
sweetie,
A
I
cold
replied,
knot tightened
my
in my
voice
stomach.
dripping with an almost
Months
theatrical
without walks.
sweetness.
No
Every
baths at all.
single day.
The words
Make a
echoed
show
in
of
my
it.
mind, each
Park it
one
in
a
a
hammer
different
blow
spot
to
on
the
the street
fragile
each
image
time.
I held of
Just to
Sarah.
be extra
My
compliant.
anger, which had
Wave
been a
at Brenda
simmering
if you
ember,
see her.
now roared into
My
a
son's grin
full-blown
widened.
blaze.
He
How could she?
understood.
How could the
This
same
wasn't just
person
about
who had
compliance.
passionately
It was
advocated for
about
Luna's
performance,
adoption,
about
who had
rubbing
cried
salt in a
tears of
wound
joy
that
when
Brenda
Luna
had
first trusted her,
self-inflicted.
now be
But my
so
mind was
utterly,
already several
callously
steps
indifferent to
ahead.
her suffering?
The officer's
It
visit
wasn't
had
just
been a
neglect,
wake-up call,
it was a
a stark
profound
reminder
betrayal
of
of
Brenda's
trust, a
relentless, petty
violation of the
malice.
unspoken
It had
promise we
also,
had made to this
inadvertently,
vulnerable creature.
handed me a
I
weapon.
tried to rein
As
in
I
my
walked back
fury,
to my
to
desk,
approach the
my fingers
situation
practically
rationally,
itching to get
but
to
it was
work.
difficult.
An idea began to
Sarah,
form,
I said,
solidifying
my
with each
voice
step.
strained with
I
barely
remembered
suppressed
seeing a
emotion.
flyer once,
This
or
isn't
perhaps
too
an
busy.
online ad,
This
for a
is
city
neglect.
portal where residents
Luna
could
is
report
suffering.
code violations.
Look at her.
My initial
She's
thought
miserable.
had been to ignore
She's
it,
in pain.
to rise above
This
the
isn't
neighborhood
okay.
squabbles.
She
But
met
Brenda
my
had
gaze with a
crossed a line.
defiant stare,
She had
her
brought
jaw
officialdom
set.
to my
Don't
doorstep,
exaggerate,
disrupted
she
my peace,
retorted, her
and
voice
tried to
sharp.
inconvenience my
She's
son.
just a dog.
This wasn't
She'll
just
be
about a
fine.
borrowed car.
She's
It was
not
about a
just a
pattern of
dog.
harassment, a
I shot
deliberate
back,
attempt
my
to cause
voice
trouble.
rising.
And now,
She's a living
it was
being
time
who
for a
depends
little
on us.
calmer.
She
I
has
sat
skin
down at my
infections,
computer,
she's
my
morbidly
fingers
obese,
flying across
and she
the keyboard
smells like
with
she
renewed
hasn't been
purpose.
cleaned in a year because
City
she
of
hasn't.
our city name,
This is
code
animal
enforcement
abuse,
portal.
Sarah.
I typed into
The
the search
argument
bar.
escalated
Within
quickly.
seconds, a
She
link
accused
popped
me
up.
of
I clicked
overreacting,
on it,
of being
a sense of
dramatic,
grim
of caring
satisfaction
more about the
settling
dog
over
than
me.
about her.
The portal
It's
was
not like she's
surprisingly
your dog
user-friendly,
anyway,
a clean
she sneered,
interface with
a
clear
cruel edge to
categories
her
for different
voice.
types of
I
violations.
adopted her.
Overgrown
She's mine.
weeds, abandoned
That line,
vehicles,
she's not
unpermitted
your dog,
construction,
hit me
trash
harder than
accumulation,
anything else.
illegal
It
dumping.
was a dismissal
My
of
eyes
my
scanned the
bond with
list,
Luna,
a
a
mental
denial
checklist
of all
forming
the
in my
hours I
mind
had
as I
poured into
recalled the
earning her
various
trust,
infractions
of
I had
all the love
observed
I
on
felt for
Brenda's
her.
property over the
It was a
years.
stark
I
reminder that
navigated to
legally
the
she was
submit a
right.
complaint section.
Luna was hers.
It asked for the
And that
address of the
realization
offending
filled me
property,
with a
a description of
terrifying
the
sense of
violation,
helplessness.
and the option to
Despite
upload
the raw
photos.
fury,
I didn't
despite
have
the feeling
photos
of
of
utter
Brenda's
disgust,
backyard,
a
not
part
yet,
of me,
but I
the
had
part
something
that still
better.
clung
The
to the
memory
hope
of
of
the
the
code
person I thought
enforcement
Sarah
officer's
was,
visit.
wanted to
His
believe her
camera pointed
promises.
squarely at her
She saw
property.
the depth of
This
my
wasn't
anger,
just about
the pain in
reporting.
my eyes,
It was
and
about
she shifted
leveraging.
tactics.
I entered
Her
Brenda's
voice
address,
softened,
my
she put on a
fingers
contrite
hovering over the
expression,
description
and she
box.
promised,
What to
I
write?
know I
I
messed
wanted
up.
it to be
I'm so
factual,
sorry.
undeniable,
I'll do better,
but also
I promise.
comprehensive.
I'll
I
walk her every
started with the
day,
most
I'll
obvious,
bathe her this
overgrown
weekend, I'll take her
vegetation
to the
and
vet.
accumulation of
The
debris
words
in
were
both front
exactly
and
what
rear
I wanted to
yards.
hear, what
I
I
paused,
desperately needed to
thinking.
believe.
The
I was
officer had
exhausted by
spent
the
a
fighting,
considerable
by the
amount of
constant
time at
worry
her
for
house.
Luna, and
He
the
must have
idea of
seen
things
something
returning to normal,
significant.
of
My
Sarah being
mind
the person
replayed
I
the
thought she
scene,
was
him
too
pausing,
tempting
camera
to
out,
resist.
surveying.
So,
He wouldn't
against
have
my
just
better
stood there
judgment,
for nothing.
I gave her another
Then,
chance.
a thought
I
struck
swallowed
me.
my anger,
Brenda had been
pushed down the
boasting for
gnawing
years
doubt,
about
and chose to
renovations.
believe in her
She'd
capacity for
mentioned
change.
tearing down
But
walls,
deep down,
building
a little
extensions,
voice whispered that this
redoing
was
the
a
entire
mistake,
backyard.
that promises
But I
made
had
under
never
duress
seen any
were
signs
rarely
of permits
kept.
posted.
And that voice,
No
I
official
would soon
notices.
discover, was
Nothing that
painfully,
suggested these were
tragically
legitimate,
right. The
sanctioned
days
projects.
that followed were a
This was a
slow,
common issue in our
agonizing
city.
descent
People
into
doing
disillusionment.
extensive work without the
Sarah's
necessary
promises,
approvals,
so earnestly
often leading
delivered
to
in the
unsafe
heat of our
conditions
argument,
or property value
evaporated like
depreciation
mist
for
in the
neighbors.
morning sun.
This was a
Nothing
goldmine.
changed.
I added a
Absolutely
second
nothing.
complaint, carefully
Luna
wording
continued
it,
to deteriorate.
suspected unpermitted
Her excessive
construction
weight
and
made it
renovation
difficult for her
work.
to move, her
Significant
skin
structural
issues worsened,
changes
and the
observed over an
pervasive,
extended period
unpleasant
without
odor
visible
became a
permits.
constant presence in our
I
apartment,
knew this was a serious
suffocating
one.
reminder of the
Unpermitted
broken
work
trust.
could lead to
I
heavy
watched her,
fines, stop work
heartbroken,
orders,
as she struggled
and
to
even
climb onto
demands
the
for
couch,
demolition
her
if the
once
work wasn't
bright
up to
eyes
code.
now dull
This
and
wasn't
resigned.
just petty.
The constant
This was
scratching,
potentially
the whimpering in
devastating.
her sleep,
I
the
clicked
labored
submit for both
breathing,
complaints.
it was a
A
daily
feeling
torment.
of profound
I
vindication
tried
washing
again,
over me.
gently at
The portal
first,
confirmed that
reminding
the
Sarah
complaints
of her
had been
promises.
successfully submitted
Hey,
and would be
did you get a
reviewed by a
chance to
code
walk Luna
enforcement
today?
officer.
Or
The
should
system
we
even
schedule that
provided
vet
a
appointment
complaint
for
number
Luna's
for
skin?
tracking.
Each
I
time,
made a note
I
of
was
it,
met with a
a
new
small,
excuse.
triumphant
Oh, I
smile
was too
playing on my
busy.
lips.
Or,
As I
forgot.
closed the browser,
Or, I'll
I
do it
noticed the
tomorrow.
date and
The
timestamp on the
excuses grew
confirmation.
increasingly
It was the very
flimsy,
same day
her
the
tone
officer
more
had visited
dismissive,
our house.
until my attempts
The
to even
timing
bring
was
up Luna's
perfect.
welfare were
He
met
had
with
been to our
outright
place,
hostility.
then
Our
directly to
apartment,
Brenda's. hours.
once a
My
haven of shared
complaints,
laughter and
submitted just
affection,
hours after his visit,
transformed into a
would likely be
battleground.
cross-referenced
Every
with his own
conversation became an
observations.
argument.
It was a
Every
beautiful,
interaction fraught
symmetrical
with
act
tension.
of poetic
The
justice.
subject was almost
Karma,
always
it
Luna,
seemed,
her
was not only
declining
finding
health,
its way
and
home,
Sarah's shocking
it was knocking on
indifference.
Brenda's door
Why
with a
aren't you
clipboard
doing
and a
anything?
camera. And I had just
plead,
given it a
my
little
voice
nudge.
laced with
The next few
desperation.
days passed
She's
with an
suffering.
almost unbearable
Sarah
slowness,
would simply
each hour
shrug,
feeling like an
sometimes
eternity
even
as
roll
I
her
waited
eyes.
for the inevitable
She's
fallout.
fine,
My
she'd
son,
insist,
true to
even
his
as Luna
word
lay
and with a
whimpering in the
mischievous glint
corner.
in his eye,
You're obsessed
began
with
his
her.
daily ritual
She's
of moving
not your
the borrowed car.
responsibility.
He'd back it
That
out of the
phrase,
driveway,
"She's
drive
not
it
your
around the block,
responsibility,"
and then park
became
it in
her
a
mantra,
slightly
a
different spot
shield
on the
she
street,
wielded to deflect
sometimes
any
even across the
criticism,
street,
any
just to
accountability.
emphasize the point.
It was a
He'd
cruel
make sure to
irony,
do it at
given how
times
much
when
of my
Brenda was likely
emotional
to be out
energy
and
and
about,
time I had
tending to
invested
her
in Luna's
perpetually
well-being
half-finished
from the very
projects, or,
beginning.
more
The
likely,
girl I had
peering
loved,
out from
the
behind
one
her
who had seemed
curtains.
so
I could
empathetic and
almost feel
kind,
her eyes
was now a
burning holes in the
stranger,
back of his head,
cold and
her
unfeeling
frustration
towards a
mounting with
creature
each
she had once
perfectly
claimed
legal,
to adore.
perfectly
The
compliant
constant
maneuver.
fighting was
It was a
draining,
small, daily
eroding
act
the
of
last
rebellion,
vestiges
a
of our
silent taunt
relationship.
that I knew was
The love
driving
I
her
once felt for
absolutely
Sarah
mad.
was being
I,
slowly,
too,
painfully
found myself
replaced by a
checking the
bitter
online
resentment.
portal multiple
I
times a
started
day,
spending more time
almost
out of the
obsessively.
apartment,
I
seeking
knew it would take
refuge at the
time for the
library
complaints
or
to
a
be
friend's
processed,
place, simply
assigned,
to
and
escape the
acted upon,
suffocating
but the
atmosphere of
anticipation
neglect
was a
and
potent
tension.
drug.
But
I
even
imagined the
then,
code
my
enforcement
thoughts were
officer,
consumed
the
by
same
Luna.
one who had
I
visited
couldn't
us,
abandon
reviewing
her.
his notes from
The
our
thought
street,
of leaving her in
comparing them
Sarah's
with the new
uncaring
complaints that
hands
had
was
just landed on his
unbearable.
digital
She
desk.
was helpless,
The thought of him
dependent on
connecting the
us,
dots,
and I felt an
realizing that the very
overwhelming
person
moral
who had
obligation to
instigated a
protect
petty
her,
complaint
even if
against
it
us
meant
was now
staying in a
facing a
toxic
barrage of far
relationship
more
that was
serious
slowly
accusations,
destroying me.
filled me
I
with a
was
quiet,
trapped, caught
simmering
between my
satisfaction.
dwindling
One
affection for
afternoon,
Sarah and my
about 3
unwavering
days after the
commitment to
initial
Luna.
visit,
The
I saw him
situation
again.
felt hopeless,
This
a
time,
dark
he wasn't
cloud
just
hanging
pausing
over
in front of
every
Brenda's
aspect of my
house.
life.
He was
I
actively
knew something had
engaged.
to give,
He was
but I
walking
couldn't
around
see a
her
way
property,
out, not
clipboard
without
in hand,
abandoning the one
making
creature who
notes,
truly
and,
needed me.
crucially,
The
taking
air
more
in the apartment
photographs.
grew thick
He
with
spent a
unspoken
significant
resentments
amount of
and the
time in
heavy
her front
scent of
yard,
Luna's neglect.
peering at the piles
Our
of
fights
debris,
became
the
less about
overgrown
Luna's
weeds,
care and
and the
more about the
various
fundamental
construction
breakdown
materials
of
strewn
trust
about.
and respect
Then,
between
he
Sarah and me.
disappeared around the side
The
of her
love I
house,
once felt for her
presumably
had
to
curdled
inspect the
into a bitter
backyard.
cocktail of
My heart
disappointment
gave a
and
little leap
anger.
of triumph.
I started to
This
withdraw,
wasn't just a
spending
cursory
more
check.
time in my own
This
head,
was a full-blown
observing,
investigation.
analyzing,
My
feeling the
complaints,
icy grip
coupled
of
with his initial
disillusionment tighten
observations,
around my heart.
had clearly
I
triggered a more
knew,
thorough
with a
review.
certainty that
I
chilled me to the
resisted the
bone,
urge to go
that our
outside and
relationship
offer him a
was
glass of
beyond
water,
repair.
or to
The
wave,
person I had
or to
fallen
do
in love
anything
with
that
was
might
either
reveal
an
my
illusion
involvement.
or had
I
simply
wanted
ceased
to
to
remain an
exist.
anonymous,
Then came
unseen
the phone
force,
call that
pulling the
shattered the
strings from
last
the
remaining
shadows.
shards of my
My
naive hope.
revenge, if you could
It
call
was
it
Mark,
that,
a
was
mutual
best
friend,
served
his
cold and
voice
unseen.
hesitant, almost
Later that evening,
apologetic.
after
He
dinner,
started with
I
small
logged back
talk,
into the
but I
city's
could
code
hear the
enforcement
discomfort in
portal.
his tone.
My fingers
Finally,
trembled
he just
slightly as
blurted
I
it out.
navigated to the
Look,
check
man,
complaint
I
status
didn't want to be the
section
one to
and
tell
entered
you,
the
but
complaint
I thought
numbers
you
I
should
had
know.
meticulously
I saw
saved.
Sarah out
I
last
braced
night
myself,
with someone
expecting
else.
to see a
They were
status like
pretty
under review
close.
or
He
assigned to
described
officer.
the scene, the
What I
intimate
saw
gestures,
instead made me
the way
gasp,
they were
a
looking at each
quiet,
other.
triumphant
It wasn't
sound
just
that
a
drew my
casual
son's
encounter.
attention from his
It was
video game.
unmistakable.
2 new
Sarah
complaints
was
had been
cheating.
officially
A
opened for
strange
Brenda's
calm
address.
settled over me,
Not just
a
my
chilling
submitted
clarity
ones,
that
but
replaced the
asterisk
storm
new
of
asterisk
emotions.
ones,
It wasn't
initiated
shock,
by the city
not really.
itself.
Deep
One
down,
read,
I think I had
overgrown,
known, or at
trash-filled
least
backyard,
suspected, that something
violation
else
of
was
Property
amiss.
Maintenance
The
Code Section
emotional distance, her
302.4.
increasing
The
defensiveness,
description
her
was
casual
chillingly
cruelty,
precise,
it all made
detailing
a
the
terrible
extent of the
kind of sense
neglect and
now.
accumulation
The
of
cheating
refuse.
wasn't just a
The
betrayal
words
of our
trash-filled were
relationship, it
particularly
was a final,
satisfying. It
undeniable
confirmed
confirmation
everything I
of her
had suspected
character
about
or
her
lack
backyard,
thereof.
and it meant
It
the officer had
solidified
indeed
everything I had
ventured
been
back
feeling
there
about
and
her
seen it for
disregard
himself.
for Luna,
The
for
second new
me, for
complaint was
any
even more
sense of
potent:
responsibility or
unpermitted
loyalty.
construction,
The
violation
revelation,
of
while
Building Code
painful,
Section
also brought with it a
105.1.
perverse sense of
This was the
liberation.
big one.
The decision,
This wasn't
which had
just about
felt impossible
untidiness.
just moments
This was
before,
about structural
now became
integrity,
starkly clear.
safety, and
I had to
potentially
leave.
significant
There was no
financial
going
penalties.
back, no
The
mending this
description
broken
detailed
thing.
observations
But the
of
thought
recent
of leaving
construction
Luna
activity,
behind, of
including
abandoning her to
foundation
Sarah's
work and structural
uncaring hands,
alterations,
was an
without any
unbearable
visible
agony.
permits posted.
She was the
It even
innocent party
mentioned
in
a
all of
specific
this,
date of
the
observation,
silent victim of
which I
Sarah's
knew was the
neglect
day the
and my
officer had been
misplaced
at our
trust.
house and then hers.
I wouldn't
A wave
walk
of
away from
pure,
her.
unadulterated
She had become my
satisfaction washed over
responsibility,
me.
my
It was
silent
better than
promise
I
to
could
a
have ever
creature who had
imagined.
suffered enough.
The officer
A
hadn't
plan
just
began to
noted my
form in my
complaints.
mind,
He had
cold and
independently
precise.
verified them and
I needed
initiated his
proof,
asterisk own
undeniable
asterisk
evidence.
official actions.
Not not just
This
of the
wasn't just
cheating,
me
which was
reporting
now
Brenda.
secondary,
This was
but
the
of the
city,
neglect.
with its full
If I was going to
bureaucratic weight
take Luna,
coming
I
down on
needed
her.
to ensure
The
there was
wheel
no
of
way
karma,
Sarah
it
could fight me
seemed,
for her.
was not only
I
turning
needed to
but
build an
accelerating.
unassailable
I
case.
leaned back in my
The
chair,
anger,
a
which had
slow,
been a
triumphant
destructive
smile
force,
spreading across
now
my
channeled
face.
itself into
My
a
son,
focused
seeing my
determination.
expression,
This wasn't
paused his
just about
game.
ending a
What is
relationship.
it,
It was
Mom?
about rescuing
Did something
Luna,
happen?
about ensuring her
Oh,
safety and
something
well-being.
happened,
And I would
sweetie,
do
I
whatever it
said,
took.
my
The
voice
game had
rich with
changed.
satisfaction.
The days that followed
Something
Mark's
beautiful.
revelation were a
It seems our
strange,
dear neighbor
tense
has some
dance.
very serious
I moved
explaining
through
to
the
do to the
apartment like a
city.
ghost,
I didn't
observing,
elaborate,
documenting
but the look on
every
my face
interaction
was
with
enough.
Sarah, a
He
performance
grinned,
of feigned
understanding
normalcy.
instantly that
The
the scales
emotional
of
distance
justice
I
were
had
beginning
felt
to tip in
before
our favor.
solidified
The
into an
thought of Brenda,
impenetrable
so
wall.
smug and
My focus
self-righteous in her
narrowed
attempts to cause
entirely
us
on
trouble,
Luna and the
now facing
meticulous
the full
collection
force of city
evidence.
regulations,
I knew I
filled
had
me
to
with
be
a quiet
strategic
joy.
to
She
build
had
an
sown the
irrefutable
wind,
case.
and now she was
This
about
wasn't
to
just
reap the
about my
whirlwind.
broken heart.
And
It was
I,
about
the
Luna's
quiet,
life. My
work-from-home
phone
mom,
became
had
my
merely
primary
provided a
tool.
gentle,
Every
almost
morning, I'd
imperceptible
take
push.
photos of Luna's
It was a
current state,
victory, not
her
just for
distended
us,
belly,
but for
the
every
raw
neighbor
red
she had ever
patches of
annoyed,
skin,
every
the
rule
matted
she had
fur,
ever
the
flouted.
dullness in
The
her
game was
eyes.
far from over,
I'd zoom
but
in
the
on the
first,
inflamed areas,
decisive blow had been
capturing the
struck,
precise
and it
extent
felt
of her suffering.
incredibly,
I
deliciously
started
good.
taking short video
The
clips
days that
too.
followed were a
Luna
masterclass
struggling
in
to get
controlled
up, her
observation.
constant
I
scratching,
found
her
myself
labored
subtly
breathing,
altering
the
my
general
work-from-home
lethargy that had
routine,
replaced her
scheduling
once
my breaks
vibrant
to
energy.
coincide with
I
potential
even recorded
sightings
the
of city
pervasive
vehicles
smell,
or,
though
more
that was more for
specifically,
my
the
own
code
internal
enforcement officer.
documentation, a
My office
visceral
window
reminder
became
of
my
the neglect.
personal surveillance
I also
outpost,
began to
offering
document
a
Sarah's
privileged
lack of
view of
action.
Brenda's
I'd
unfolding
subtly
predicament.
record
I
conversations
didn't
where
want
she
to miss a
dismissed
single
Luna's
moment of
condition
this
or
karmic
offered
ballet.
flimsy
It
excuses
wasn't
for
long
not
before the
walking or
first
bathing
tangible
her.
signs of
I'd
official
note down
action
dates and
appeared.
times when I knew
About a
Luna
week
hadn't
after
been
I
walked,
submitted my complaints,
cross-referencing
a
them with
large,
Sarah's schedule.
official-looking
I
envelope
kept a
appeared in
detailed
Brenda's
log,
mailbox.
a grim
I didn't
diary
see
of
her
Luna's
retrieve it,
decline
but I
and
saw the
Sarah's
postal worker
indifference.
deliver it,
Each
and the
entry
sheer
was a
size and
painful
official
reminder of
seal
the
on the
trust that
envelope
had been
left little
shattered,
doubt as
but
to its
also a
contents.
hardening of
It
my
was
resolve.
almost certainly a
I
notice of
researched local
violation,
animal welfare
detailing
laws,
the complaints and
understanding
the
what
required
constituted
actions.
neglect
I
and what
imagined her
evidence would
face
be
as she
most
opened
compelling.
it, the
I
smug
learned about body
satisfaction
condition
slowly
scores
draining
for
away,
dogs,
replaced
confirming
by a
Luna
dawning
was
realization
severely
of the trouble
overweight.
she had brought
I
upon
looked
herself.
into the symptoms
The
of
thought
common
was
skin
exquisite.
infections in
A
dogs,
few days after
recognizing
the
the
envelope
signs on
arrived,
Luna's
a
body.
different
The
vehicle
more
showed
I
up at Brenda's
documented,
house.
the more
It wasn't the
horrifying
code
the reality
enforcement
became.
officer's car this
This
time,
wasn't just poor
but a
care.
white van
It
with a
was
city
clear,
logo,
undeniable
clearly marked
neglect.
building
The
department.
hardest part was
Two
maintaining my
men,
composure
wearing
in
hard
front of
hats and
Sarah.
carrying
She
clipboards,
seemed
emerged from
oblivious,
the van.
or perhaps
They
simply
spent a
didn't care
considerable
about
amount
my
of time
internal
inspecting
turmoil.
the exterior
She
of Brenda's
continued her
house,
casual
particularly
dismissals of
the
Luna's
areas
health,
where she had
her vague
supposedly been
promises,
undertaking
her
her
increasingly
renovations.
frequent
They
absences.
peered at the
I let her.
foundation, measured
I
walls,
needed her to
and even
continue her
used a long
patterns of
pole with a
neglect,
camera
to dig
attached to
her
get a
own
better look at
grave
the
deeper.
roofline and upper
It was a
stories.
cold,
This was
calculated
clearly
strategy,
related to the
one that
unpermitted
went against
construction
every
complaint,
fiber of my being,
and it
but
suggested
I
a
knew
much
it was
deeper level of
necessary for
scrutiny
Luna's
than a
sake.
simple code
I
violation.
also discreetly
This was
gathered
serious.
information about
I
Luna's
watched, a
adoption.
silent
Where were the
spectator,
papers?
as they
Who was
meticulously
listed as the
documented
primary
everything.
owner?
They
I
even
knew
took
Sarah had
samples of
handled
some
the
of the building
adoption, but I
materials,
needed to confirm
carefully
the
bagging them.
legalities.
It was
I
a
found a
forensic
copy of the
examination,
adoption
a
agreement
stark
tucked away in a
contrast to the
drawer.
casual glance
Sarah's
the first
name was on
officer
it,
had
but
given
the
our
details
perfectly
were
legal
surprisingly
vehicles.
vague about what
This wasn't just
constituted
about a
sole
messy
ownership,
yard.
and there
This
was
was
no
about
mention of
structural
a
integrity,
microchip or any
permits,
other
and
definitive
potentially
proof that would
the
make it
safety of the
impossible
building
for me to
itself.
claim her.
The
This was a
implications were
crucial
vast,
piece of
and I knew,
information,
from
a
my own
ray of
research
hope
into
in the
city
dark.
codes,
The
that
more
unpermitted
evidence I
work could
collected,
lead to
the
massive
more
fines,
confident I
orders to
became that I
cease and
could win this
desist,
fight.
and even,
The
in
quiet
extreme cases,
documentation became my
demands to tear
secret
down the
weapon,
illegal
a silent
construction.
preparation for the
Brenda, for her
confrontation I
part,
knew was
seemed to be in
inevitable,
a
a
state of
confrontation
agitated
that would
denial.
decide Luna's
I
future.
saw her
The
interacting with the
apartment
building
felt like a
department
ticking time
officials,
bomb.
her body
Every
language a
day,
mixture
the
of
tension
defensive
ratcheted up a
indignation and
notch.
bewildered
I
frustration.
continued my
She
meticulous
gesticulated
documentation,
wildly,
each
pointing,
photo and video
arguing,
clip a
but the
painful
officials
testament
remained
to Luna's
impassive,
suffering
simply
and
nodding,
Sarah's
making
indifference.
notes,
The
and
evidence
continuing their
pile
methodical
grew, a
inspection.
damning
It
indictment
was
of
clear
neglect.
they were not
I
swayed by
felt
her
a
usual
strange mix of
histrionics.
dread and
They were
anticipation.
professionals,
The
simply doing their
confrontation was
job,
coming, and
following
I
the letter
needed
of
to
the
be
law.
ready.
And the
I
law,
chose a
it
day when
seemed,
Sarah
was
was
not on
home,
Brenda's
not
side.
rushing out to work or to
Meanwhile,
see her
my
new
son
paramour.
continued his
The
daily
air was
car-moving
thick with
ritual with
unspoken
unwavering
words, the
dedication.
usual
He'd
strained
often
silence
choose the exact
punctuated
time
by
Brenda
Luna's
was out
soft
watering her
whimpers and the
wilting weeds
incessant
or retrieving
scratching
her
of her
mail,
irritated
making
skin.
sure she had a
My
front row
heart
seat
pounded
to his
in my
perfectly
chest,
legal,
a drumbeat
perfectly
of
annoying
resolve.
compliance.
This was
He'd give her a
I walked
wide,
into the living
innocent
room where
smile
Sarah
or a
was
polite
scrolling on her
nod,
phone,
a silent
Luna
acknowledgement
lying
of the
listlessly
absurd
nearby.
situation she had
I
created.
didn't mince words.
It was a beautiful,
Sarah, we
subtle
need to
form
talk
of psychological
about
warfare,
everything.
and Brenda,
She looked up,
predictably,
a
was
flicker
losing.
of
Her
annoyance in her
face grew
eyes.
increasingly
What now?
pinched,
Is
her
this about
movements
Luna
more
again?
frantic.
I
The
told
spring
you
in
I'll
her
get to
step,
it.
usually fueled
No,
by her
I
self-righteous
said, my voice
indignation,
steady,
seemed to have
betraying none of the
evaporated,
tremor in my hands.
replaced by a
This
defeated
is
slump.
about you.
One
and me,
afternoon,
and
I
Luna.
saw her attempting to
I
clear some of the
paused,
debris
letting
from her
the weight
front
of my
yard.
words hang
She
in
was
the air.
moving slowly,
I know about him,
half-heartedly,
Sarah.
clearly
I know you've
overwhelmed
been
by the sheer
cheating.
volume of
Her
accumulated
face went
junk.
white.
It was
The
a
phone
futile
clattered to
effort,
the floor.
a single drop
Her
in an
eyes,
ocean of
usually
neglect.
so defiant,
She looked tired,
widened in shock
defeated,
and then
and
narrowed
utterly
in a
out of her
desperate
depth.
attempt at
The
denial.
sight brought a
What are you
grim
talking about?
satisfaction.
That's
This wasn't about
ridiculous.
Schadenfreude,
Who told you
not
that?
entirely.
It doesn't
It was
matter who
about
told
justice.
me, I stated,
She had
my
deliberately
voice
tried to cause
unwavering.
us trouble,
What
to
matters
disrupt
is
our
that it's
lives
true.
with false
And
accusations.
it's over.
And now she
Before
was
she could
facing the
launch into a
consequences of her
tirade of
own long-standing
accusations or
disregard
denials,
for community
I pulled out my
standards
phone.
and city
But
regulations.
that's not the only
I
reason we're
continued to
done.
monitor the
I
online
opened my
portal.
photo gallery,
The status
scrolling through
updates
the
were
damning
slow but
images.
steady. The
This,
overgrown,
I said,
trash-filled
holding the
backyard
screen towards
complaint
her,
was now
displaying
listed
a
as
close-up
notice
of
of
Luna's
violation
inflamed
issued.
skin.
Compliance
Is what you've
required
done to
by
Luna.
date.
I
The
scrolled through more
unpermitted
photos.
construction
Luna's
complaint was
bloated
even more
body,
serious.
her matted
Investigation
fur, the raw
ongoing.
sores.
Building permit
Then,
review
I played a
requested.
short video clip of
This
Luna
meant they were
struggling to
digging
walk,
into city
her
records,
labored breathing
checking
audible.
for any permits she
Sarah's
might have
initial
pulled,
shock
which I
turned
was
to a
confident
mixture
she
of
hadn't.
horror and
The thought
disbelief.
of her trying to
She
navigate the
recoiled
bureaucratic
slightly,
maze,
as
the
if the
fines
images
piling up,
themselves
the
were
potential
physically
stop
repulsive.
work orders, the
What is
sheer
all
headache
this?
of it all
She stammered,
filled me
her
with a
voice
quiet
thin.
sense of
You've
triumph.
been
She had
spying on
wanted
me?
to cause us
I've
trouble,
been
to make our
documenting your
lives
neglect.
difficult.
I corrected, my
Instead,
voice
she had
cold.
merely opened
Every
a
single
Pandora's box
instance.
of her own
The
making.
weight gain,
And
the skin
I, the
infections,
quiet,
the lack of
unassuming
walks,
neighbor,
the lack
had
of
merely
baths,
held up the mirror.
the suffering
The
you've
reflection,
inflicted on a
it
helpless
seemed,
animal
was not
you
to her
claimed to
liking.
love.
The wheels of
I
justice,
paused,
though
letting the
slow, were
gravity of my
grinding
words
inexorably
sink in.
forward,
This
and Brenda was
relationship
squarely
is
in their
over,
path.
Sarah.
The show,
And I'm
I
taking Luna
realized,
with
had
me.
only just begun.
Her eyes
The next
blazed
few
with a
weeks
sudden
brought a
fury.
crescendo of
You
activity
can't.
at Brenda's
She's my
property,
dog.
transforming
I
her
adopted
previously
her.
stagnant,
Do you have
chaotic
official
yard
proof of
into a hub of
ownership?
frantic,
I
albeit
challenged, my
disorganized,
voice rising
effort.
slightly.
The initial
A
official
microchip
notices had
registered in
clearly
your name?
spurred her into a
vet
desperate
bill with your
attempt at
name on it
compliance,
for anything
though
other
her
than her
approach was
initial
as
checkup?
haphazard and
Because I
inefficient
have
as her
months of
initial
documented
renovations.
neglect, and I'm prepared to
Large,
share it with everyone we
industrial-sized
know.
dumpsters,
Our
the
mutual
kind typically
friends, your
used for
family,
construction
even
debris,
the animal
began
shelter
appearing
you
in front of
adopted
her
her from.
house, only to be
I
filled
watched her
and
face
replaced with
carefully.
alarming
The
frequency.
threat hung
I
heavy in
watched,
the air,
fascinated,
potent and
as
undeniable.
she, sometimes
Her
with the reluctant
defiance
help of a
wavered,
family member or
replaced by a
two,
dawning
began to clear
realization
out the
of the
accumulated
consequences.
junk from her front
The
yard.
power had shifted.
Piles of
The
warped
color
lumber,
drained from
broken
Sarah's
furniture,
face as the weight of
discarded
my words
appliances,
settled upon
and
her.
bags of what
The
looked like
initial
general
fury that
household
had
trash
flared
were
in her
heaved into
eyes
the
quickly
dumpsters.
extinguished,
It was a
replaced
monumental
by a
task,
chilling
a
blend of
testament to
fear
years
and
of neglect,
calculation.
and it was
She
clear
knew.
she was
She
struggling.
knew the
Her
evidence I
movements
held
were
was
slow,
damning.
her
The
face
photos,
perpetually
the
flushed with
videos, the
exertion
detailed
and,
log,
I suspected,
it wasn't just my word
humiliation.
against hers.
The sound of her
It was
struggling, the
irrefutable,
scraping of debris,
and the
the
threat of
occasional
exposure,
frustrated
of having
shout,
her true
became the
character
new
laid bare
soundtrack
for
of our
all our
quiet
mutual
street.
friends and
It
family
was a
to
stark
see, was a
contrast to the
powerful
usual
deterrent.
gentle hum of my
Her
work-from-home
reputation,
life.
carefully
But I
constructed and
found myself
maintained,
not
was
minding
on
the
the line.
disruption.
You
Each thud
wouldn't,
of something
she
heavy
whispered,
hitting the
but there was
dumpster was
no
a small
conviction in her
victory,
voice,
a tangible
only a
sign that
desperate
Brenda was
plea.
finally being
Oh,
forced
I
to confront the mess
absolutely
she had
would,
created,
I countered,
both
my
literally
voice
and
firm,
figuratively.
leaving no room for
However,
doubt.
the
You've
unpermitted
proven you're
construction issue was
incapable of
proving to
caring
be a
for her.
far more complex
You've
beast.
neglected her to the
While the
point of
yard
abuse.
cleanup was
I'm
physically
not
demanding,
leaving her here to
it was a
suffer any
relatively
longer.
straightforward
She's
task.
coming with me.
The building
And if
code
you try to stop
violations,
me,
on the other
if you try
hand,
to make this
required
difficult,
professional
every single
intervention.
person we know
I
will see
observed more
exactly
city
what kind of
vehicles,
person you are.
different
They'll
departments
see the
this time,
pictures, they'll
making
hear the
visits.
stories,
There
they'll
were
know you
engineers,
cheated, and they'll know
inspectors,
you let
and
an
even,
innocent
on one
animal
occasion,
suffer.
a
I
representative
watched
from
her
the city's
closely,
legal
waiting
department.
for her reaction.
Their visits were
For a
longer,
long,
more
tense
detailed,
moment,
and
she
often
just
involved
stared at
hushed
me, her
conversations with
mind
Brenda,
clearly
who
racing,
looked
weighing
increasingly
her
distraught.
options.
I
The
overheard
silence in the room
snippets
was
of these
deafening,
conversations
broken
when I was
only by
outside,
Luna's soft,
retrieving mail or
uneven
watering
breathing.
my own
I could
perfectly
see the
manicured
internal
flower
struggle
beds.
playing out on her
Phrases
face,
like structural
the
integrity,
anger, the
lack of
humiliation,
permits,
the fear
retroactive
of public
inspections,
shame.
and potential
Ultimately, the
demolition
fear
floated
won.
on the breeze.
Her shoulders
It was
slumped,
clear that the
and she
city
let
was
out a
not messing
defeated
around.
sigh.
They were
Fine,
demanding proper
she muttered,
plans,
her voice
engineering
barely
reports,
audible,
and,
laced
most
with
likely,
venom.
significant
damn
fines
dog.
for all the work
I
she
don't
had done
care.
without permission.
The words were
The cost
harsh,
of bringing
but they
everything
were
up to
exactly
code
what I
after
needed
the
to hear.
fact would be
It was over.
astronomical,
The
far
legal
more expensive
technicality
than if
of
she
who
had done it
adopted
correctly
Luna
from the
suddenly
start.
became irrelevant
My
in the
son,
face of
meanwhile,
overwhelming
continued
evidence
his
and the
daily
threat
car
of
ritual
public
with
exposure.
unwavering
She had
enthusiasm.
no
He
official
had even
proof of
started
ownership
varying
beyond
his
the
route,
initial adoption
sometimes
papers,
driving around the
which, as
entire
I had
block before
discovered, were
parking,
surprisingly
sometimes
vague and
just moving
didn't
the car a
specify
few
sole
feet forward
ownership
or
in a
backward
way
in the
that would stand
driveway.
up against a
He'd make
claim
sure
of
to do
neglect.
it when Brenda
More
was outside,
importantly, she had
often
no
giving her a
moral high
cheerful
ground,
wave that was
no
clearly
leg to
designed to
stand
grate
on.
on her nerves.
I didn't waste
The
another
sight of her
second.
flinching
I
or
moved
turning her
quickly,
back in
gathering Luna's
exasperation
few
was a
belongings,
small,
her bed,
daily
her
dose of
favorite
satisfaction.
worn-out toy,
He was
her
a
food
master
bowl.
of subtle,
Luna,
relentless annoyance,
sensing the shift
and
in the
Brenda was a
atmosphere,
perfect
watched
target.
me with a
One
cautious
afternoon,
curiosity.
a large,
I knelt
official-looking
down,
sign
gently
was
stroking
posted
her
on
head.
Brenda's front
"It's
lawn.
okay, Luna,"
It was
I
bright yellow,
murmured,
with
my
bold
voice
black
thick with
letters,
emotion. "We're
indicating a
going
stop
home.
work order issued by the
Arregloma.
city building department.
She gave a
It
weak
cited
tail wag,
specific code
a flicker of
violations
hope
and
in her
warned of
tired
severe
eyes.
penalties for
I carefully
non-compliance.
picked her up.
This was a
Her
major
weight was
escalation.
shocking, a heavy
It
testament
meant that
to her
any
neglect.
further work on her
She whimpered
renovations was
slightly,
strictly
but
forbidden
then
until
settled
all
into my
issues were
arms,
resolved and
resting
proper
her head
permits
against my
obtained.
chest.
It was a
It felt
public
right.
declaration
It
of her
felt like she was
transgression,
finally where she
visible
belonged.
to every
I
passerby,
walked out
every
of that
neighbor.
apartment,
The
Luna
shame of
in my
it,
arms,
I imagined,
leaving Sarah
must have been
standing
overwhelming.
amidst the wreckage
I
of
saw
our
Brenda
relationship,
staring at the sign,
surrounded by
her
the
shoulders
silent
slumped, her
accusations
face
of
a
her own
mask of
making.
defeat.
The door
She tried
closed
to pull it
behind
out of the
me,
ground
a
once,
definitive
but it
end
was
to
firmly
one chapter,
planted,
and
and
the
she quickly
hopeful,
gave up,
albeit
retreating
uncertain,
into her house.
beginning of another.
The sight was
Luna
almost
was
pitiful,
free,
but the
and so
memory
was
of her
I.
petty,
The drive
vindictive
away from
actions
that
against
apartment
us
felt
quickly
like an
hardened my
escape from a
resolve.
suffocating
This
cage.
wasn't just about her.
Luna,
It
nestled
was
on the
about the
passenger seat,
principle.
looked
She
up at
had
me with
chosen to
eyes that
operate
still
outside
held
the
a flicker
rules,
of
to
apprehension,
inconvenience
but
others,
also a
and now
nascent
the
trust.
consequences were
I
catching
kept
up to
one
her.
hand on her,
The
gently
overgrown,
stroking her
trash-filled
head,
backyard
murmuring
complaint,
reassurances.
according to the portal,
"It's okay,
was
Luna.
moving towards
We're safe
compliance
now.
achieved status,
Everything's going to
as
be
she was
okay."
slowly but surely
My
clearing
own
the
heart,
debris.
which had been
But
a
the
leaden weight in
unpermitted
my chest for
construction
months,
complaint remained
felt a
stubbornly
fragile
under
sense of
investigation
lightness,
or
a
notice of
glimmer of
violation
hope for the
issued,
future.
with no signs
My
of
first
resolution.
priority was Luna's
This was the
health.
real
The
albatross
moment
around
we
her
arrived
neck,
at my
the
parents'
one that would
house,
likely
my
cost her a
temporary
fortune and cause
sanctuary,
her endless
I called a
headaches.
local
The
veterinary
neighborhood,
clinic.
usually
I
quiet and
explained the
reserved,
situation,
began to buzz
emphasizing
with
the
hushed
urgency
whispers.
of Luna's
Neighbors,
condition.
who had long
They were
suffered
able
in
to squeeze
silence
us
under
in for an
Brenda's reign of
emergency
petty terror
appointment that
and her
very
property's
afternoon.
unsightly
The
condition,
vet's office
were
was a
now openly
whirlwind of
discussing the
activity, but the
situation.
staff were
There was a
incredibly
palpable
kind
sense of
and
collective
understanding.
relief, a quiet
Luna,
satisfaction
despite her
that
fear of
justice, in its
strangers,
own slow,
seemed to sense the
bureaucratic way,
benevolent
was
intent.
finally being
The vet,
served.
a
No
compassionate
one
woman
knew
with
I was the
gentle hands,
catalyst, and I
conducted a
preferred
thorough
it that way.
examination.
My
As she
role was
worked,
that of the
I
unseen
recounted
hand,
Luna's
the
history,
quiet
the
architect
initial
of karma.
abuse, her
As I
recovery,
watched
and
Brenda
then the
struggle, a
devastating
thought
neglect
occurred to
under
me.
Sarah's care.
Her initial
I
complaint
showed her the
against us had
photos
been
and
so
videos
trivial,
I had
so
meticulously
easily
collected.
resolved.
The vet's
Yet, it
expression
had triggered a
hardened with
chain
each
of events
image.
that was now
"This is
consuming her.
severe neglect,"
It was a
she
powerful lesson
confirmed,
in
her voice
unintended
grave.
consequences,
"She's
a
morbidly
testament to the
obese,
idea that
which puts
sometimes
immense
the
strain on her
smallest
joints
stone
and
thrown
organs.
can cause the
Her
biggest
skin
ripples."
is severely
And as the sun
infected,
set,
likely a
casting long
combination of
shadows over her
bacterial
still
and yeast
cluttered,
infections,
now
which
officially
is
sanctioned
incredibly
against
painful
property,
and itchy.
I felt a
And
profound
her
sense
ears
of
are
peace.
also
The
inflamed.
balance had been
It's clear
restored.
she hasn't been
The
properly
presence of the
cared
stop
for in
work
a
order
long
sign
time.
on Brenda's lawn
She
became a
prescribed a course
constant,
of
glaring
antibiotics for the
reminder
skin
of her
infections,
predicament.
medicated
It was a beacon of
shampoos,
her failure,
special ear
visible
drops,
to
and
every
a strict
person who
diet plan
drove or
to
walked down
slowly
our
and
street.
safely bring her
The
weight
initial
down.
flurry of
She
activity
also
around her
recommended
property,
blood tests to
the
check for
frantic
any
dumpster
underlying
filling,
metabolic
began to
issues due
subside.
to the rapid
It was
weight
as if
gain.
the sheer
Leaving
scale
the
of the
vet's
task,
office, I
coupled
felt
with the
a
weight of the
renewed
official
sense of
demands,
purpose.
had finally
This wasn't
overwhelmed
just
her.
about getting
The
Luna out.
dumpsters were
It was
still
about
there,
getting her
but they
healthy.
sat half-empty
The
for
road
days,
ahead would be
a
long,
testament to
but
her
I was
dwindling
ready for it.
resolve.
My
I
parents,
continued my
who had
daily
witnessed Luna's
observations,
initial
a silent
transformation
voyeur
and
to
then
her
her
unfolding
heartbreaking
drama.
decline, were
My son,
incredibly
ever the
supportive.
dutiful and
They
delightfully
welcomed her
petty
with open
participant,
arms, showering her
maintained
with
his
the quiet
car-moving
affection
routine.
and
He'd
consistent
often
care
whistle a
she
cheerful
desperately
tune
needed.
as he backed
The
out of the
first few
driveway,
weeks were
making
challenging.
sure the engine's
Luna was
rumble
still
was just loud
uncomfortable,
enough to carry
still
across the
scratching,
quiet street.
still
I
adjusting to a
imagined
new
Brenda,
environment.
stewing
But with
inside her house,
consistent medication,
hearing the familiar
regular
sound
baths
and
with the
knowing that her
medicated
petty
shampoo,
complaint had
and
only
a
served to
carefully measured
empower our
diet, I
defiance.
started to
The
see
online
glimmers of her
portal
old
became my
self.
daily
The
newspaper,
smell began
my
to
source of
dissipate,
updates on
replaced by
Brenda's
the
karmic
clean
journey.
scent of
The
medicated
overgrown,
shampoo.
trash-filled
The
backyard
incessant
complaint
scratching
finally
lessened,
moved
and
to
the angry
compliance
red
achieved.
patches on her skin
This meant
slowly
she
started
had,
to heal.
at least to the
Her
city's
eyes,
satisfaction,
once dull,
cleared enough of the
began to
debris to
regain their
meet the basic
sparkle.
requirements.
Each small
It was a small small
was a
victory
victory,
for her,
a
but one
testament
that
to
had
her
clearly come at a
resilience and my
significant cost
unwavering
in terms of
commitment.
effort,
I knew
money,
she wasn't
and
out of the woods
pride.
yet,
Her
but for
front
the
yard,
first time in a
while still
long
a far
time,
cry from
I felt a
pristine,
profound
no
sense
longer
of
looked
hope.
like a landfill.
Luna was
The weeds
finally
were
on the
cut,
path to
the
true
piles of
recovery,
lumber were
and I
gone,
was
and the
determined to
general
see her
clutter
through
had
it.
been
The
significantly
journey to Luna's
reduced.
full
It was
recovery
a
was a
vast
testament to
improvement,
patience,
one that the entire
consistency,
neighborhood
and
quietly
unwavering
appreciated.
love. It wasn't an
However, the
overnight fix.
uncommitted
It was a
construction
slow,
complaint remained
deliberate
stubbornly
process, a
unresolved.
daily commitment
Its
to her
status
well-being.
fluctuated
Each
between
morning
notice
began
of
with a
violation
careful
issued,
measurement of her
under review by
specialized diet
building
food,
department,
ensuring
and
she
legal
received
action
the
pending.
precise nutrients without
This was the crux
overfeeding.
of her
Her
problems, the
medication
deep,
regimen was
systemic
meticulously
issue that couldn't
followed.
be solved with a few
Antibiotics
hours
for
of
her
yard
skin,
work.
eardrops
I knew
for
from
her
my
inflamed
research that
ears,
these
and
types of
medicated
violations
baths
could
every
lead to
few
hefty
days.
fines,
The
liens on the
baths,
property,
initially a
and
struggle for
potentially
both of
the
us due
forced
to her
demolition of the
discomfort and my
uncommitted structures.
inexperience,
The
became
city
a
wasn't just
bonding
asking her
ritual.
to clean up.
I learned to be
They were
gentle,
demanding that
to
she
speak in
retroactively
soothing
prove the
tones,
safety
and to
and
make the
legality of
experience
years
as
of
positive
unapproved
as
work.
possible.
I saw more
Slowly,
official
she began to
cars,
tolerate
not just
them,
from
even
code
leaning into
enforcement
the
or the
warm
building
water,
department,
finding
but
relief
also
from
from
the
the planning
incessant itching.
department. This
Beyond the medical
suggested that the
care,
city was
the
now
most
looking at
crucial
zoning
aspect of
issues,
her recovery was
setbacks,
the
and whether
consistent,
her unpermitted
positive
additions were even
reinforcement.
allowed
I
under the city's
reintroduced
master
regular
plan for our
walks,
residential
starting with
area.
short,
It was a
gentle strolls
multi-pronged
around the
attack,
block,
a bureaucratic
gradually
hydra with
increasing the
many heads,
duration and pace
each
as her
one demanding
strength and
compliance
stamina
and
improved.
paperwork and,
She was still
inevitably, money.
overweight, but with
Brenda
each walk,
herself
her
seemed to
movements
shrink under
became
the
less
pressure.
labored,
Her
her
usual
breathing less
confident,
strained.
almost
We
aggressive
explored
demeanor
new
had
parks,
vanished.
discovered
She
new
rarely
scents,
ventured
and
out,
slowly,
and when she
her
did,
joy in
it
the
was with a
simple act
hurried,
of being
furtive air,
outdoors returned.
avoiding eye
Her
contact with
tail,
anyone.
which had been
Her
so
once loud
lifeless,
boasts about her
began to wag with
renovations had
renewed
ceased
vigor,
entirely,
a joyful
replaced
blur
by a
that
sullen
spoke
silence.
volumes.
The
The skin
neighborhood,
issues,
which had
which had
long
been
been
so
subjected
severe,
to her
began to clear
self-aggrandizing
up. The
pronouncements,
angry red
now
patches
enjoyed a
faded,
blissful
the
quiet.
fur started to
One
grow back
afternoon,
in, and
I
the
noticed a
constant
new piece
scratching
of paper
subsided.
taped to the
The
stop work order
pervasive,
sign.
unpleasant
It was
smell
another
finally
official
vanished,
notice,
replaced
this
by the
one
clean
even more
scent of a
severe.
healthy dog.
It was a
Her
notice of
coat
intent
regained
to
its
impose
natural
penalties
luster,
and
soft
detailed
and
a
shiny.
schedule of
It was
escalating fines for
incredibly
continued
rewarding to brush her,
non-compliance.
feeling
It
the
also
smooth,
mentioned a mandatory
healthy fur
meeting with
beneath my
city
fingers,
officials, a
knowing
kind of
how far she
pre-hearing
had come.
conference,
As
where
her
she would have to
physical health
present her
improved,
case and her
so
plan
too
for
did her spirit.
remediation.
The
The
lethargy
language
that
was
had plagued
formal,
her lifted,
legalistic,
revealing
and
the
utterly
playful,
unforgiving.
curious
I
dog I
imagined
remembered.
Brenda receiving
She
this,
started
the weight of the
initiating
city's
playtime,
bureaucracy
nudging
pressing
toys
down
with her
on her.
nose,
She had
inviting
tried
me
to
to
wield the
chase her
city's
around the
power
yard.
as a weapon
Her
against us,
confidence
and
blossomed.
now that same
She no
power was
longer
being wielded
cowered at
against
sudden
her,
movements
with
or
far
loud
greater
noises.
force and
While
justification.
still a
The
naturally
irony
timid
was
dog, the
palpable,
deep-seated
almost
fear had been
poetic.
replaced by
The
a quiet
financial
assurance.
implications alone
She would
must have
follow
been
me from
staggering.
room to room,
Lawyers'
a loyal
fees,
shadow,
engineering
and curl
reports,
up at my feet
architectural
whenever I
plans,
sat down,
permit
her
fees,
soft
and
snores a
now
comforting
escalating
presence.
fines.
The
Her grand
transformation was
renovations
profound.
were now likely
Luna was
costing
no
her
longer the
exponentially more
broken,
than she had ever
neglected creature I
anticipated,
had rescued
and for
from
all the
Sarah's
wrong
indifference.
reasons. Her
She was a
attempt to save
vibrant,
money by
happy,
cutting
healthy
corners and
dog,
avoiding
full of
permits
life
was
and
now
love.
backfiring
She was
spectacularly,
thriving, a
proving to be
living
the most
testament to the
expensive
power
mistake
of
of her life.
consistent care
My
and
own life,
unconditional
in
affection.
contrast, had
Every wag
returned
of
to
her
its
tail,
peaceful rhythm.
every happy
The brief
sigh,
disruption
every
caused
playful
by the
bark
code
was a
enforcement
quiet
officer
victory,
had faded,
a confirmation that I
replaced
had
by the
made the
quiet
right choice,
satisfaction
that
of
she
knowing
was
that
truly
justice was
mine,
being
and that
served.
she was
My
finally
son's
home.
car was
The
moved
bond
daily,
between us
a
had
small,
deepened into
almost
something
ritualistic
unbreakable,
act that served as a
forged in the
constant,
fires of
gentle
adversity and
reminder to
cemented
Brenda
by
of
the
her folly.
quiet,
We were
daily acts of
compliant,
love.
we were
As
peaceful,
Luna
and we
continued
were,
to
in our
flourish,
own way,
her health and
victorious.
happiness becoming
The
a
story
constant
wasn't
source
over,
of joy in
not
my
yet.
life, I
Brenda
realized
still
something
had to
was missing.
navigate the
While
labyrinthine
Luna
world
had
of
me
city
and my
permits and
parents' quiet
regulations.
companionship,
But the
she was
tide had
still an only
irrevocably
dog.
turned.
I
She was no
remembered how
longer
much
the
she had
aggressor,
loved playing
the
with other dogs
instigator
in the
of
park
petty
before her
complaints.
decline,
She
how
was
her
the one on the
confidence had
defensive,
soared when she
caught in a
interacted
web
with
of her
friendly
own making.
canines.
And
The thought
I,
began
the
to take
quiet,
root.
observant
Luna
neighbor,
deserved a
had
friend,
merely
a
provided the
companion who
initial,
spoke her
almost
language,
imperceptible
who could
tug on
match
the
her
first
newfound
thread.
energy
The
and
unraveling,
playfulness.
it seemed,
The
was
idea of
entirely her
adopting
own
another
doing.
dog
The
filled me
quiet
with a
hum of my
quiet
work-from-home
excitement.
life
I
settled
spent
back into
weeks
its comfortable
researching,
rhythm.
looking for a
But now
dog
it
that
was
would
underscored
complement
by a
Luna's
subtle,
personality,
almost
someone
imperceptible
gentle,
shift in the
playful,
neighborhood's
but
atmosphere.
not overly
The
boisterous,
tension that Brenda's
given Luna's
presence had
past
often
timidity.
generated
I
seemed to
visited
dissipate,
local shelters and
replaced by a
rescue
sense of calm.
organizations,
Her
explaining
house,
Luna's
once a
story
source
and
of
her
constant
needs.
low-level
I wanted to
irritation,
ensure the new
was now a
addition would be a
monument to her
perfect fit,
self-inflicted
a true
woes.
companion
The
for her,
stop work
not
order
just
sign
another
remained firmly
responsibility.
planted in her
Then
lawn,
I saw him.
a stark
His
reminder
name
of
was
the
Gus,
city's
a
unwavering
scruffy,
resolve. I
medium-sized mutt with
continued my
soulful
daily
brown
checks
eyes
on the
and an
online portal,
incredibly sweet,
watching the
calm
status
demeanor.
of the
He was
unpermitted
a little
construction
older than Luna,
complaint.
perhaps
It was a
3 or
slow,
4, and had a
bureaucratic
gentle,
dance, but the
laid-back
direction
energy
was
that I
clear. The
immediately
city
felt
was
would
not
be a good
backing
match.
down.
He
The
had been
status
surrendered
updates
by his
indicated
previous
that the
owners
case
due
was
to a
moving
move,
through
and the
various
shelter
stages of
staff
review,
described him
with
as
notes about
affectionate and
engineering
with other
reports
dogs.
requested,
I
and structural
arranged a meet and
integrity
greet,
assessments
bringing
pending.
Luna along to
It was
see
a
how they would
complex and
interact.
costly process,
The initial
and I
encounter
knew
was
Brenda
cautious,
was likely
as
drowning in
expected.
paperwork and
Luna,
legal fees.
ever the careful
Brenda
observer,
herself
sniffed
became
Gus
even more
tentatively.
reclusive.
Gus,
I rarely
with
saw
his
her
calm
outside,
wisdom,
and when I
approached her
did, she was a
slowly,
ghost of her
offering
former
a gentle
self,
sniff in
shoulders
return.
hunched, eyes
There was no
downcast,
immediate
a perpetual
explosion of
frown
playful
etched on her
energy,
face.
but there was
The
no
defiant
aggression
set of
or
her
fear
jaw,
either.
once so
Just a
familiar, was
quiet,
gone,
mutual
replaced by a
assessment.
look of weary
Over the next few
resignation.
minutes, as I
She no
spoke
longer
softly to
engaged
both
in
of
her
them,
usual
they
neighborhood
began to
gossip
relax.
or her
Gus
self-aggrandizing
gave a
tales of
tentative tail
renovation.
wag,
The
and Luna,
silence from her corner of the
surprisingly,
street was,
reciprocated
for
with a
us, a
small,
welcome relief.
almost
The
imperceptible
absence
wag
of her
of her
drama
own.
was a drama
It
in
wasn't love at
itself.
first sight,
My
but it
son,
was a
bless
promising
his
start.
heart,
I brought
continued his
Gus
daily
home a few
car-moving
days
routine
later
with the
after
dedication of a
completing the adoption
professional.
paperwork.
He had even
The first
started
few
varying
days
the
were
time
an
of day he
adjustment
moved
period,
it,
as
just
any
to
new
keep Brenda
introduction would
guessing.
be.
Sometimes
was a
it was
little
first thing in the
reserved,
morning,
observing Gus
sometimes
from a
midday,
distance.
sometimes
Gus,
late afternoon.
true to his nature,
He'd often hum
was
or whistle
patient
as he
and
did it,
respectful of
a
her
cheerful,
space.
almost
I made
taunting
sure to give them
soundtrack to her
both
misery.
equal attention,
He'd park
never
it in front
forcing
of her house,
interactions,
then across
allowing
the
them
street,
to acclimate
then
at
back
their
in our
own
driveway,
pace.
always
Slowly,
ensuring it was within
almost
the letter of the law.
imperceptibly at first,
It was a
their
small,
bond began
daily
to
act
form.
of psychological
It started
warfare,
with shared
and
naps on
Brenda
the
was
same
clearly
rug,
on the losing
then
side.
tentative sniffs
I could
during
almost
walks.
feel her frustration
Soon, I began
radiating
to
from her
witness
house.
the small,
One morning,
heartwarming
I
moments that
noticed a new
confirmed my
car
decision.
parked in front of
A
Brenda's
shared
house.
toy, a
It was a
gentle nudge,
sleek,
a playful
expensive-looking
chase in the
sedan,
backyard.
not a city
Gus,
vehicle.
with his
A man
calm,
in a sharp
steady
suit
presence,
emerged,
seemed to bring
carrying a
out an even
briefcase.
greater
He looked
confidence
like a
in
lawyer.
Luna.
He
He was
spent
her
a long
anchor,
time
her
inside
playmate,
Brenda's house,
her furry
and when he
confidant.
left, Brenda
Watching
walked
them
him to the
curl up
door,
together,
her face
Luna's
pale
head
and drawn.
resting on Gus's
The
back,
presence of
or
legal
seeing them
counsel
chase each
confirmed
other
my
around the yard,
suspicions.
barking with
Brenda
pure
was now
joy,
deep in the legal
filled my heart
quagmire,
with an
fighting a
indescribable
battle she was
warmth.
clearly losing.
Luna wasn't just
The cost of
healthy
this
and
battle,
happy.
I
She was
knew,
now
would be
truly complete,
astronomical.
with a
The
best
thought
friend
of
who
her
understood
financial
her in a
woes,
way no
while not
human ever
something
could.
I actively
They
wished
were
upon anyone,
inseparable,
was a
two
direct
perfectly
consequence
matched
of her own
souls,
actions.
and their
She
companionship
had
was a
tried to cut
beautiful,
corners,
living
to
testament
bypass
to the healing
regulations,
power of
and to
love
avoid
and
the proper
friendship.
channels,
While
all
Luna's
while
new
trying to
life
cause
with
trouble
Gus
for
brought
others.
immense joy.
Now,
The
the
shadow of
chickens were
Sarah
coming home
still
to
loomed,
roost,
albeit
and they were demanding
faintly,
a very
in the periphery.
expensive meal.
We
A
shared
few
mutual
weeks later,
friends,
another
a common
official
social
notice
circle
appeared
that
on
had once
Brenda's
been the
door,
bedrock of
this
our
one even
intertwined
more
lives.
ominous.
I
It was a
knew it was
notice
only
of
a
public
matter of
hearing
time before
regarding
the
the
narrative of
unpermitted
our breakup
construction.
and Luna's
This meant the
disappearance
case was
would reach
escalating
them.
beyond
I had
administrative
anticipated
notices and
Sarah's
into a formal
reaction,
legal
her likely
proceeding.
attempt to
It would
control
be
the
held at
story,
City
to
Hall,
paint me
open
as
to
the
the
villain.
public,
And
and
I was
Brenda would be
prepared.
required to
It
attend and
started
present
subtly
her
at
case.
first. A
This was
few
the
days
city's
after I
final
left,
step
I
before
began to
imposing
receive
severe
hesitant
penalties,
texts from mutual
including
friends.
potentially ordering
Hey,
the demolition
heard
of
you
the
and Sarah
unpermitted
broke
work
up.
if she
Is
couldn't
everything
bring it into
okay?
compliance.
Then,
The thought of
questions
Brenda
became
having to
more
publicly
pointed.
defend her
Sarah
actions,
said you just
to
up
face
and
the
left
full
her
weight
and
of the
took
city's
Luna?
legal
Is
department,
that true?
filled me with a
The
quiet,
undertone was
almost
clear.
serene
Sarah was
satisfaction.
already at work,
She had
spinning
thrived
her
on
version
public
of
drama,
events,
on
casting me
creating a
as the
spectacle
heartless
out of
ex
other
who
people's
abandoned her
lives.
and stole her
Now,
dog.
she was the
She was
spectacle.
portraying herself
I
as the
considered
victim,
attending the
the
hearing,
heartbroken
just to
girlfriend whose
witness the
beloved pet
culmination
had
of her
been cruelly
self-inflicted
snatched
misery.
away.
But
I
then I
knew I couldn't
decided
let her
against
control
it.
the narrative.
My victory
I
wasn't
had the
about
truth,
public
and I
humiliation.
had the evidence.
It was about the
But I
quiet
also knew that
satisfaction
simply
of justice
saying she
served.
cheated
My
or
role was
she
that of the
neglected
unseen
Luna
hand,
wouldn't be
the
enough for some.
catalyst, not the
People are quick
spectator.
to believe the
My
first
revenge
story
was
they
already
hear,
playing out,
especially when it
daily,
comes from
in
someone
front
they've
of my
known
very
and
eyes.
trusted.
The
I needed
neighborhood
to be
continued to
strategic,
breathe a
just
collective
as I
sigh
had
of
been
relief.
in rescuing
The
Luna.
constant threat
I
of
started
Brenda's
by
petty
responding
complaints had
calmly to the
lifted.
initial
Her
inquiries,
property, while
confirming the
not yet
breakup
fully
but not
resolved, was
immediately
no longer the
launching into
glaring eyesore
accusations.
it once was.
Yes, we
The air
broke up.
felt lighter,
It was
the silence
complicated,
more
but it was
profound.
necessary.
It was a testament
I
to the
let the
fact that
questions
one
build,
person's
allowing
negativity
Sarah's
could cast a
narrative
long
to take
shadow,
root slightly,
and that its
knowing
removal
it would
could
make
bring a
my
surprising sense
counter-narrative
of
all
peace.
the more impactful.
As the days turned into
Then,
weeks,
when the
the
whispers
stop
grew
work order
louder,
sign
when
began to
friends
fade
started
under the
expressing
relentless sun,
concern or
its
even
bright
mild
yellow turning
disapproval
a
based on
pale,
Sarah's
sickly
story,
hue.
I
But
decided
its
it was
message
time.
remained clear,
I didn't
a
blast it
constant
out to
reminder
everyone
of
at
Brenda's
once.
folly.
Instead,
And as
I
my
chose
son
a few
continued
key
his
mutual
daily car
friends,
ritual,
those I
a
trusted
small,
most,
almost
those who were
imperceptible
genuinely
smile would play on
concerned
my
and would
lips.
listen with an open
Karma,
mind.
it
I
seemed,
invited
was
them
not only
over
finding
or
its
met
way
them for
home,
coffee
it
and
was settling
calmly,
in for a long,
rationally laid out
expensive
the
stay
facts.
at Brenda's house.
Look, I
And
begin.
I, the
I know
quiet,
Sarah's been telling
work-from-home
her
mom,
side of the
was
story,
simply enjoying the
and
show.
I understand why
The
you might
final
be
act, I
confused or
knew,
even
was still to
upset.
come.
But
The
there's a
public
lot she's
hearing for
not
Brenda's
telling you.
unpermitted
Then,
construction was
I pull out my
scheduled for a
phone.
Tuesday morning,
I didn't want to
a
do
date I
this,
marked
but
on my
I feel
mental
you deserve
calendar,
to know the
even
truth,
though I had
especially
decided not
since
to
Luna's
attend.
well-being
My
was at stake.
satisfaction didn't
And then
require
I
a
showed
front
them
row seat to
the
her
photos of
humiliation.
Luna's
The
emaciated
knowledge that
body
she
when
was
she first
enduring it
arrived,
was more than
followed
enough.
by the
The
heartbreaking
thought of her
images
having
of
to
her
face a
severe
panel
weight
of city
gain, the
officials
raw
to
skin,
explain
the
years of
matted
neglect
fur,
and
the
legal
dull eyes
construction
under Sarah's
was a
care.
delicious form of
I played the
justice.
short video
In the
clips
days
of Luna
leading up to the
struggling to
hearing,
move, of
Brenda's
her
house was
incessant
eerily
scratching.
quiet.
I
The
explained the
sporadic,
vet's
half-hearted
diagnosis,
attempts
the
at cleanup
severity
had
of the
ceased
neglect.
entirely.
And
The
then,
dumpsters,
almost as
which
an
had once
afterthought,
seen some
I would mention
activity,
the cheating,
now sat
not
empty and
as the
forlorn in
primary
front of
reason
her
for the
property.
breakup, but
Their
as
rental
another
period
facet
likely
of her
expired.
betrayal and
It was as if
disregard
she had
for our
given up,
shared life.
overwhelmed
The
by the
neglect was the
insurmountable
true
task
villain
of
of the
bringing her
story,
property
the
into
cheating merely a
compliance.
symptom
The
of a
stop
deeper
work order
character
sign,
flaw.
now
The
faded and
reactions were
peeling,
immediate
remained
and
her only
profound.
public declaration.
Shock, disbelief,
My son,
then
ever
anger.
consistent,
I can't believe she
continued
let
his
Luna
daily
get like
car-moving
that,
routine.
one friend
He'd
whispered,
often
her
comment on the
voice filled
silence
with
from Brenda's
disgust.
house,
And
a
she was
subtle
blaming
acknowledgement
you?
of her
Another
retreat.
exclaimed.
She's really
The
quiet
evidence
these
spoke for
days,
itself,
Mom, he'd
far more
observe, a hint
powerfully
of
than
something
any
akin to
words I could
pity,
utter.
but
It
mostly
was
satisfaction
undeniable,
in his
heartbreaking
voice.
proof of
Guess
Sarah's
she's
true
got bigger
nature.
things to
The
worry
tide
about than my
began to
car.
turn. The
And
ripple
he was
effect
right.
of sharing the
Her
truth
world
was
had
swift
shrunk to
and
the confines
decisive.
of her legal
My
battles.
mutual friends,
A stark
once
contrast
swayed
to
by
her previous
Sarah's carefully
expansive,
crafted
meddling
victim narrative,
presence.
were now
On the day of the
confronted with
hearing, I
irrefutable
found
evidence
myself
of her callous
inexplicably
neglect
distracted.
and betrayal.
Despite
The
my
images
decision
and
to stay
videos of
home,
Luna's
a part
suffering
of me
under
was
Sarah's
drawn to the
care were
unfolding drama.
undeniable.
I
The stark
imagined the
contrast
sterile
between
hearing room,
Luna's
the
initial
stern
vibrant
faces of the
health and
city
her
officials,
subsequent
the dry
deterioration,
recitation of code
juxtaposed with Sarah's
violations.
dismissive
I pictured
attitude and then the
Brenda, perhaps
revelation of her
accompanied by her
infidelity,
lawyer,
painted a
trying to
picture of a
explain away
person
years
far
of
removed
blatant
from the
disregard
charming,
for
empathetic
regulations.
woman they
It
thought
was
they
a
knew.
scene I had conjured
Word
many
spread
times in
quickly
my
through our
mind,
shared
and
social
it played
circles.
out with
It
satisfying
didn't take long
clarity.
for the
The
initial
day
shock to
passed,
morph
and
into
by late
widespread
afternoon, I
disappointment
checked
and
the
anger
online
directed
portal.
at Sarah.
The
People
status
who
of
had
the
known her for
unpermitted
years,
construction
who had seen
complaint
her
had been
seemingly
updated.
dote on
It
Luna in
now
the early
read,
days,
case
were
reviewed,
appalled by the
final order
extent of the
issued.
neglect.
There
The
was a
cheating,
link to a
while a
PDF
significant
document.
betrayal in
My
itself,
heart
became
pounded a little
secondary to
faster
the
as I
moral
clicked on it.
outrage over
The
animal
document was
cruelty.
dense,
It
filled with
highlighted
legal
a deeper
jargon,
character
but the
flaw,
key
a
points were
complete
clear and
disregard for
devastating.
responsibility
Brenda
and
was found in
compassion.
violation of
Sarah,
multiple
who had been
sections
so
of the
quick to
city's
badmouth
building
me,
and zoning
found her
codes.
carefully
She was
constructed
ordered to pay a
facade crumbling
substantial
around
fine,
her. Her attempts
retroactive
to
for the
double down
entire
on her
period the
victimhood were
unpermitted
met with
work had been in
skepticism,
place.
then
The
outright
document
rejection.
also
When
stipulated
she
a
tried
strict
to reiterate her
timeline for her to
story,
submit
that I
proper
was a heartless
architectural
ex who
plans,
stole her
obtain
dog,
all
friends would
necessary
simply
permits,
respond with,
and bring the
"We've seen
entire
the
unpermitted
pictures,
structure
Sarah.
into
We know
compliance.
what Luna looked
If
like.
she failed to do
We
so
know you
within the
weren't taking
specified
care of her."
timeframe, the city
Or, more
reserved the
bluntly,
right to
we
issue a
also know
demolition
about
order,
him.
requiring
The
her to
social
tear down the
consequences
illegal
for her
additions
were
at her own
severe.
expense.
Invitations to
Furthermore,
group
a lien
gatherings
would be
dried
placed
up.
on her property
Texts
until
and
all
calls
fines
went
were paid
unanswered.
and all
Her
violations
once
rectified.
vibrant social
It was
life,
a
built on a
comprehensive,
foundation of
unsparing
shared
judgment.
friendships,
The
began
fines
to wither.
alone would likely be
People who had
crippling,
once been
let
her
alone the
closest
cost of hiring
confidants
architects,
slowly distanced
engineers,
themselves.
and
It
contractors to
wasn't a coordinated
retroactively
attack.
fix years of
It was a
unpermitted
natural
work.
consequence
The
of her
threat of
actions being
demolition was the
exposed.
ultimate hammer,
No one
a
wanted to be
final,
associated
undeniable
with someone who could
consequence.
so
Her
callously
grand
neglect a
renovations
helpless
were now a
animal, let
financial and
alone
legal
betray a
nightmare.
partner in such a
I
manner.
closed the
I
PDF,
didn't
a
revel in her
profound sense of
isolation, but I
vindication
felt a
washing over
grim
me. This
satisfaction that
wasn't just a
justice,
slap
in
on
a
the
social
wrist.
sense,
This
was
was a
being
full-blown
served.
reckoning.
My focus
Brenda had
remained on
played with
Luna,
fire,
on her
and now
continued
she was getting
recovery and
burned,
happiness.
badly.
I
The
shared
karma,
updated
it
photos
seemed,
of
had
Luna
not
and
only
Gus,
found its way home
healthy
but
and
had moved in
thriving,
and
with the
taken up
same
permanent
friends who had seen the
residence. The
heartbreaking
following
images of her
days
neglect.
confirmed the
These
severity
new
of the
pictures
order.
were a
I
powerful
saw a new,
counter-narrative,
smaller
a
sign
visual
appear on
testament to the
Brenda's
positive
property.
impact of
This one
proper
from a
care
local
and
real
love.
estate agent,
They showed Luna,
discreetly
now
placed in a
lean
corner
and
of her
muscular,
yard.
her fur
It was a
gleaming,
for sale
her eyes
sign.
bright with
My
joy,
breath
playing
hitched.
happily with
She
her
was
new
selling.
best friend,
The
Gus.
realization
The
hit me with a
contrast was
mixture of
stark.
surprise and a
Sarah's
deep,
life,
quiet
once seemingly
satisfaction.
perfect,
The
was now
pressure, the
marred by her own
fines, the
choices.
legal battles,
My
the
life,
sheer
once filled
impossibility
with
of bringing her
tension and
property
worry,
into
was
compliance,
now
it had
enriched
all
by
been
the
too much.
unconditional love
She was
of two
cutting her
happy,
losses,
healthy dogs.
fleeing the
Sarah
consequences
had
of her
no
own
one
actions.
left, not
The
because I
for sale
actively
sign
campaigned
was not
against
just
her,
a symbol
but
of her
because her own
defeat.
actions,
It was a
once
symbol of our
exposed,
victory.
spoke
She had
louder than
tried to
any
drive
words.
us out, to
The
make our
truth,
lives
as it often
miserable,
does,
but
had set
instead,
me free,
she was the one
and
being
in
driven
doing
away.
so, had
The
left her
thought was
utterly
almost
alone.
too good to be
Life
true.
with Luna
The
and Gus
process of
settled
selling
into
a
a
house,
rhythm of
especially
quiet
one with
contentment and
significant code
boundless joy.
violations and a
The
lien
chaotic,
against it, would
emotionally
not be
draining
easy.
chapter of my
It would
life with
likely
Sarah
involve a
was
substantial
firmly
price
closed,
reduction,
replaced by
and
a
the new
peaceful
owners would have to
existence
take on the
centered
burden
around
of
the
rectifying the
unconditional love
issues.
of my two
Brenda
furry
would not walk
companions.
away from this
My
unscathed,
apartment, once a place of
financially or
tension and
otherwise.
neglect, was
As
now
the
a
days turned
vibrant,
into weeks,
happy home,
the for sale
filled with the
sign
comforting
remained,
sounds
a
of
silent
soft
testament
snores,
to the ongoing
playful
saga.
barks, and the
Potential
gentle thud
buyers
of
would
wagging
occasionally
tails.
drive by, slow
Luna's
down, and
transformation
then
was
quickly
complete.
drive away after
She was
seeing
no
the faded
longer just
stop work
healthy,
order
she
sign
was
and the general
radiant.
disarray of the
Her
property.
once distended
It was
belly was
clear
now
that selling
lean
her
and
house would
strong,
be a
her
challenge.
muscles toned
My
from
son,
regular
seeing
walks
the
and
for sale
enthusiastic
sign,
play.
finally
Her fur,
understood the full
once
extent
dull
of the
and matted,
situation.
gleamed with
She's
health,
really leaving,
soft to the
isn't
touch
she?
and
He
completely
asked,
free
a
of
hint
any
of awe in
lingering
his
skin
voice.
issues.
Because of
Her
all
eyes,
this.
once haunted by
Yes,
fear and
sweetie,
pain,
I
now
confirmed,
sparkled
a
with
soft smile on
intelligence,
my face.
curiosity,
Because of
and
all
an
this,
undeniable
karma
joy for
always
life.
finds its way
She
home,
moved with
remember.
an effortless grace, her
He nodded
steps
slowly,
light and
a thoughtful
energetic,
expression
a
on his
stark
face.
contrast to the
He
labored
continued to
shuffle
move
of
his
her
car
neglected
daily,
past.
a ritual
And
now
Gus?
imbued with a deeper
He was the
meaning.
perfect
It
complement.
wasn't just about
His calm,
compliance.
steady
It was about
presence
the
had
quiet,
truly brought out the
persistent
best in
power of
Luna.
knowing you were in
They
the
were
right and
inseparable,
watching
a
justice
dynamic
unfold.
duo who
The
navigated
neighborhood
the
was
world
finally
together.
getting its piece
They
back.
chased
One
squirrels in
car
the park
move,
in perfect
one
tandem,
faded sign,
shared
and one for
sunbeams on the
sale sign
living
at a
room
time.
rug, and
The
curled up
story of
together
Brenda's
on their dog
downfall,
bed,
set in
a
motion
furry
by her
pile
own
of
petty
contented
malice,
size.
was nearing its
Gus,
triumphant
with his patient
conclusion.
nature, would
The
often
for sale
nudge
sign
Luna
on
into
Brenda's
play
lawn
when she was
became a
being too
permanent
reserved,
fixture, a
and
stark
Luna,
monument
in
to her
turn, seemed to
capitulation.
draw
It
confidence
stood
from his
there, day after
unwavering
day,
companionship.
week after week,
Their bond was a
slowly weathering
beautiful
under the
thing
sun
to
and rain.
witness, a
The
testament to the
The
healing
long
power
shadow
of
she had
friendship.
cast over our
My
street
days
had
revolved
finally
around their
lifted.
needs,
The
but
very
it
next
never
day,
felt like a
the new
burden.
family moved
Early
in.
morning walks,
They were young,
shared
energetic,
meals, long
and seemed
evenings spent
genuinely
with them
excited
curled up
about their new
beside me as
home,
I studied
despite
or
its obvious
relaxed.
challenges.
Their
They
presence was a
waved to us
constant
as they
source of
unloaded their
comfort and
boxes,
grounding.
their
They
faces bright
reminded
with
me of the
optimism.
simple joys
It was
in
a
life,
refreshing
of
change,
loyalty,
a breath
and
of
of the
fresh air.
profound
I
impact one
checked the
person can
online
have on
portal one
another,
last
even
time.
if that
The
other is a
unpermitted
four-legged
construction
creature.
complaint status
The
had
emotional
finally
scars
changed
from the
to case
breakup and the
closed,
betrayal had
property
faded,
sold,
replaced by a
violations
quiet
transferred
strength
to new
and a
owner.
clearer understanding
This
of what
meant that
true
Brenda had likely
responsibility
taken a
and love
significant
entailed.
financial
I
hit,
had learned
selling the
invaluable
property at a
lessons about
reduced price
trust,
to account
about
for the
discerning
outstanding
character,
fines
and
and the
about
cost of
standing up for what
remediation.
is right,
The new
even when it's
owners,
difficult.
by purchasing the
Luna was
property,
not just a
had
dog.
assumed the
She was a symbol
responsibility
of
for bringing it
resilience,
into
a living
compliance.
reminder
It was
of
a
the
tough
battle I
deal
had
for them,
fought and won.
but for Brenda,
My
it
social
was the
life,
ultimate
which had been
consequence.
temporarily
She had been
disrupted,
forced to
slowly
offload her
rebuilt
problem,
itself on a
and in
more
doing so,
authentic
had paid a
foundation.
heavy price.
The friends who had
My
stuck by
son,
me,
seeing
who
the
had
new
seen the
family,
truth, were the
finally
ones who
stopped his
truly
daily
mattered.
car-moving
We
ritual.
shared a deeper
It was
bond
no
now,
longer
built on
necessary.
honesty
The
and
borrowed
shared
car,
values.
now fully
I no
compliant
longer
and
had to
properly
navigate the
registered, could
complexities
stay
of a
put.
toxic
The
relationship
petty
or the
battle was
pretense
over,
of a
and we
social
had
circle
won.
tainted
The
by
entire
deceit.
saga,
Today,
from Brenda's initial
Luna is
petty
my
complaint
dog,
to her eventual
unequivocally
forced
and completely.
departure, was a
She is
vivid
perfectly
illustration of
healthy and
karma in
happy,
action.
a
She had
vibrant,
tried to
joyful
cause us
soul
trouble,
who has
to
found her
disrupt our
forever home.
lives with false
And she is
claims and
best
malicious
friends with
intent.
Gus, her loyal
Instead,
companion,
her actions
completing
had
the picture
boomeranged
of a
back on
life
her
that,
with devastating
despite its
force,
difficult beginnings,
forcing her to
is now
confront
filled
years
with
of
an
her own
abundance of
neglect and
love,
illegal
peace,
activities.
and wagging
Her
tails.
attempts to cause us
Every
trouble
day
had
with them is a
backfired
blessing,
spectacularly,
a quiet
proving that
victory over
karma
the
always
darkness of the
finds its way
past,
home.
and a
And
testament to the
sometimes,
enduring
it even
power of
brings a for
compassion.
sale sign.